I woke up with a kitchen knife in my hand, a dead man's memories in my head, and a slab of meat on the cutting board that smelled like it had already started planning its own funeral. A fat man beside me slapped the counter and shouted that 3 customers were waiting. He wanted the meat boiled, drowned in spice, and served before anyone noticed the gray edges. Then, pale letters appeared over the cutting board. Ingredient: river boar flank. Condition: spoiled. Safe preparation: none. Recommended action: discard. I understood 2 things at once. I had died on Earth, and whoever had sent me into this new body had apparently decided that one miserable life in a kitchen had not been enough. The fat man shouted again. I looked at the rotten meat, then at the knife in my hand. If this strange ability was real, I had just been given the one thing every cook dreamed of: perfect information. If it was fake, I was about to get fired before I had been alive for 10 minutes. I threw the meat into the waste bucket. The owner made a sound like someone had stabbed him. His name arrived from the memories of the body I had inherited. Doran Pell, owner of the copper ladle, cheap with salt, cheaper with wages, and somehow proud of both. Evan Rook, the young man whose body I now occupied, had worked for him for 14 months. Evan had no parents, no clan, no cultivation talent worth mentioning, and no savings beyond 12 copper coins hidden in a cracked jar upstairs. 3 days of fever had nearly killed him. Doran had still made him work. I remembered the fever. I remembered collapsing by this exact stove. I also remembered headlights on wet asphalt from my old life, a delivery truck skidding through a red light, and the strange, weightless second before impact. Both lives ended in kitchens. Apparently I was difficult to get rid of. Doran grabbed the edge of the bucket. His round face turned purple. He demanded to know whether I had lost my mind. That meat had cost 6 copper. Evans set the knife down before he was tempted to use it for something that would make employment irrelevant. He told Doran that serving rotten meat would cost more than 6 copper when customers started vomiting in the street. Doran replied that customers at the copper ladle did not have enough money to complain. That sentence told Evan everything he needed to know about his new employer. 3 laborers sat beyond the kitchen curtain, banging spoons against chipped bowls. The original order had been meat noodles. The pantry offered almost nothing useful. A basket of wilted greens, half an onion, bone scraps from yesterday, a jar of bean paste, dried noodles, cheap enough to double as packing cord. Evan picked up one of the bones. The pale letters returned. Ingredient: river boar femur. Condition: acceptable. Best use: roasted bone broth. Optimal roast: moderate heat, 19 minutes. Simmer threshold: low rolling boil. Compatible ingredients: onion, fermented bean paste, bitter leaf. He stared at the words for 3 seconds. The information was precise, but there was no magical hand moving his knife. No invisible chef poured water into the pot. The stove did not light itself. Evan had spent 12 years cooking professionally on Earth. His hands knew how to strip meat from a bone, how to judge the weight of a pot, how to keep cheap ingredients from tasting cheap. The ability did not replace skill. It removed uncertainty. That was far more dangerous. Doran demanded again that he explain what he was doing. Evan told him he was preventing 3 customers from dying in his dining room. Doran told him that if this failed, the price of the meat was coming out of his wages. Evan considered the 12 copper in the cracked jar upstairs and decided he could survive losing all 12. He roasted the bones until their edges darkened. He blistered the onion directly over the flame and scraped away the char. He washed the bitter leaf twice because the information hovering over it warned that a 3rd wash would remove too much aroma. He stirred a spoon of bean paste into the broth, only after lowering the heat. The kitchen slowly changed smell. At first, it smelled like a kitchen that had been used too long and cleaned too little. Then came roasted bone, sweet onion, the dark saltiness of fermented beans, and something almost floral from the bitter leaf. The 3 laborers stopped banging their spoons. Doran stopped shouting. A woman walking past the open front door slowed down. Evan tasted the broth. It was not magical. It did not fill him with spiritual energy or heal his exhausted body. It was simply the best possible version of what those ingredients could become. On Earth, chefs spent years chasing that moment, the second when a dish stopped being a collection of ingredients and became one complete thing. Here, pale letters had just shown him the path. He cooked the noodles separately, so their starch would not cloud the broth. He sliced the last edible scraps of yesterday's pork, thin enough to stretch across 3 bowls. He finished each serving with bitter leaf and a trace of hot oil. The first laborer took a mouthful. He stopped chewing. Doran's expression brightened with vindication, clearly assuming the man was about to spit it out. Instead, the laborer pulled the bowl closer with both hands and asked why the copper ladle had been hiding food like this. The other two started eating faster. The oldest of them drank the broth directly from the bowl. The woman from outside stepped through the door and asked what they were eating. Doran immediately announced that it was the copper ladle's new house specialty. Evan nearly dropped the ladle on his foot. By noon, the remaining broth was gone. Doran charged 2 copper a bowl instead of the normal one. People still bought it. Then he congratulated himself for improving the menu. Evan leaned against the kitchen wall and discovered another unpleasant fact about his new body. It was weak. His wrists ached after lifting the stockpot. His legs trembled after 6 hours on his feet. The original Evan had eaten badly, slept badly, and possessed almost no spiritual cultivation. This world, according to his inherited memories, was ruled by people who could split stone with a palm and leap across rooftops. Most ordinary citizens cultivated a little, enough to strengthen the body, resist disease, and work harder. Great clans raised warriors who could cut through armored beasts. Above them stood immortals whose lives stretched for centuries. Evan could probably lose an argument with a determined chicken. For the moment, survival came first. Doran waited until the evening rush ended before presenting him with a new rule. From now on, Evan would cook all special dishes. The price would remain 2 copper. Evan's wage would remain exactly the same. Evan asked whether Doran planned to increase his share. Doran laughed so hard his chair creaked. Evan said nothing more. He had dealt with restaurant owners on Earth. Some problems crossed worlds unchanged. He went upstairs after closing and opened the cracked jar beneath his narrow bed. 12 copper coins. He turned one over between his fingers, then caught his reflection in the dented wash basin beside the bed. The new face was lean and pale from fever, with dark cobalt hair that refused to lie flat. A single silver streak cut through the hair above his right temple, and his eyes were a clear amber that looked much brighter than the exhausted face around them. At least nobody in this world was going to mistake him for Doran's nephew. In the outer district of the capital, 1 copper bought a bowl of rough grain porridge. 5 copper bought a night in a shared room. 50 copper rented a market cart for a week. 100 copper made a silver coin, and 20 silver made a gold. Silver was the money of craftsmen and small merchants. Gold usually appeared only in clan business, military contracts, and the accounts of people rich enough to stop checking the price of dinner. Evan had enough money to be poor for several days. He also had a gift that could tell him exactly how to use an ingredient. The sensible thing was obvious. He needed to stop making Doran rich. The problem was that he did not yet own so much as a spoon. For the next 4 days, he worked. He watched prices at the market in the morning. He learned which stalls sold produce close to closing for half price. He tested the ability on everything he could touch without getting slapped by a merchant. A green plum showed an ideal pickling window of 2 days. A cheap river fish displayed 3 preparation methods, one of which warned that the bitter line beneath its spine had to be removed within 10 minutes of gutting. A bundle of ordinary mushrooms contained 1 toxic specimen. The pale text marked it immediately. Evan realized the ability was more valuable than simply making tasty food. Food in this world could be dangerous. Spiritual plants stored energy unevenly. Beast meat sometimes carried violent residue. Wealthy cooks used cultivation to force those energies into submission. Poor cooks relied on experience and luck. Evan could see exactly where the danger lay. He was thinking about that on the 5th night, when the most dangerous woman on the continent walked into the copper ladle wearing a plain black cloak. Of course, Evan had no idea who she was. She looked like an unusually beautiful traveler, with expensive habits, and a face that suggested she had never once been told to wait for anything. Her hair was the first thing he noticed. It fell almost to her waist, silver white, with a faint violet sheen whenever it caught the lantern light. A narrow golden crescent rested against her forehead, partly hidden beneath the hood. Her eyes were a clear, unnatural violet, not purple from makeup or candlelight. Violet like polished amethyst. She looked about 27. The original Evan's memories insisted that powerful cultivators could remain young for centuries. That seemed relevant, but not as relevant as the fact that she had just sat at the only clean table. Doran saw her clothing and hurried over himself. He bowed too deeply and offered every dish in the house. The woman glanced toward the kitchen and said she wanted whatever smelled like roasted bone and bitter leaf. Doran called for Evan. There were 3 orders ahead of hers. Evan told him so. Doran stared at him as though he had started speaking whale. The woman heard anyway. She turned her violet eyes toward the kitchen. She asked whether he knew who she was. Evan looked at the line of customers, then at her. He said he did not. Her gaze sharpened. He added that even if she were the governor's daughter, the old man at table 3 had already paid. The old man at table 3 became very interested in the grain of the wood. Doran nearly choked. The woman seemed to consider several possible responses. One of them was probably execution. Then she sat back. She waited. The old man took an extremely long time finishing his noodles. Evan suspected he was enjoying the situation. When the woman's turn finally came, Evan checked the remaining ingredients. The broth from earlier was gone, so he built a faster soup from river fish bones, onion, dried pepper, and a small amount of white radish. The system recommended scorching the fish bones until they were nearly brittle, then simmering them hard for only 12 minutes. The woman watched from the table. Evan could feel her attention even through the curtain. He plated the noodles with thin slices of radish and a piece of fish crisped in a pan. Doran carried the bowl out personally. The woman lifted the spoon. The first taste changed almost nothing on her face. Only her fingers stopped moving. Then she took another spoonful and another. By the time Evan looked out again, the bowl was empty. She asked for a second. Evan was already scraping the pot. He told Doran the kitchen was closed. Doran began to object, then glanced at the woman's expression and reconsidered his attachment to life. The woman stood. For a moment, the air in the room became heavy. Cups rattled. The old man at table 3 lowered his eyes. Doran's knees bent as though someone had dropped a sack of flour onto his shoulders. Evan felt it too. Pressure. Vast, quiet, controlled. Then it vanished. The woman placed a gold coin on the table. A whole gold coin. Doran's eyes looked ready to leave his skull. Evan picked it up, walked back to the table, and placed it in front of her. He told her the noodles cost 2 copper. She said she did not carry copper. Evan told her that was a strange problem to have in a place where dinner cost 2 copper. The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. She left the gold coin anyway. Doran grabbed it the moment the door closed. Evan watched him hide it in his sleeve. Then he looked through the open doorway. The silver-haired woman had disappeared into the evening crowd. He had no idea that less than half an hour later, she would step through a hidden gate in the inner palace, dismiss 3 kneeling ministers with a glance, and ask her chief attendant a question that would terrify an entire imperial kitchen. Where exactly did poor people buy river fish? The silver-haired woman returned 2 nights later. This time she brought copper. Evan knew because she placed 20 perfectly polished coins on the counter before she sat down, as if she had purchased them from a collector rather than received change from a shop. Doran merely folded himself in half, greeting her. She ignored him and asked Evan what he was cooking. He had spent the afternoon testing mushrooms from the Eastern market. Most were ordinary brown caps sold by farmers for almost nothing. One variety carried a faint natural warmth that the system identified as useful for circulation when cooked gently. It was not a medicine. It would not repair an injury or deepen cultivation. It was simply nutritious food with a mild spiritual property. Evan had turned them into dumplings. The woman ordered one bowl, then another. Then she asked why the second tasted slightly different. Evan told her he had changed the ratio of ginger because the mushrooms in the second batch were younger. She looked down at the dumpling between her chopsticks. Most imperial chefs, she said, would solve inconsistency by adding stronger spiritual seasoning. Evan replied that if an ingredient needed to be beaten into submission by seasoning, perhaps the cook should stop pretending he liked the ingredient. The woman stared at him. Doran, listening from the counter, quietly moved farther away. She asked where he had learned to cook. Evan's answer was mostly true. He said he had spent years in kitchens and had learned that ingredients usually told a cook what they wanted if the cook paid attention. She said ingredients did not speak. Evan said neither did most sensible customers. That earned him the first real smile. It changed her face more than he expected. The severity remained, but for 1 second she looked younger than the impossible calm she carried. She came again 3 days later, then twice the next week. Evan never learned her name because she never offered it, and he refused to ask Doran, who had become convinced that she was some noblewoman traveling incognito. Instead, Evan privately called her Lady Violet because of her eyes. Lady Violet proved to be an unusual customer. She could identify the age of a spiritual herb by smell, but had no idea what a cheap breakfast bun cost. She could discuss military supply routes with unsettling accuracy, but once attempted to pay a child 10 silver for carrying a parcel 6 steps. She knew the heads of the capital's great clans by their personal flaws. One night she mentioned that Lord Joran of the White Crane clan was late to every meeting. Evan asked whether she worked for the palace. She said Lord Joran often knelt in front of her. Evan decided she was probably the daughter of a terrifying minister. That explanation survived until she made a drunken cultivator faint by looking at him. The man had entered the copper ladle near closing, loudly demanded wine, then decided Lady Violet's table was the best place to sit. When she told him to move, he laughed and reached for her sleeve. He froze before touching it. His face went white. Then he collapsed nose first into a bowl of cabbage. Lady Violet continued eating. Evan leaned over the counter and asked what she had done. She said she had expressed displeasure. Evan looked at the unconscious man. He told her that in his experience, most displeasure did not require a physician. He considered the question honestly. Yes, a little. This world contained people who could turn him into a stain on the wall. He was not stupid enough to feel invincible because of a cooking ability. But the woman had visited his table 7 times. She did not bully the laborers who ate beside her. She had once moved her chair so an old woman could sit closer to the stove. Whatever she was, she had given him no reason to treat her like a monster. He told her he would become frightened if she tried to avoid paying. That night, she left exactly 4 copper. Doran's patience with Evan's success lasted less than a month. At first, the owner had loved the extra customers. The copper ladle was full most evenings. Doran raised prices, cut portion sizes, and told everyone that his genius as a restaurateur had transformed the business. Then customers started asking when Evan worked. Worse, some refused to eat if Doran's nephew was cooking. Doran responded with the kind of strategy that explained why the copper ladle had been failing before Evan arrived. He doubled the price of Evan's dishes and kept all of the increase. When Evan asked for a higher wage, Doran told him that a kitchen hand should be grateful for employment. Evan asked whose recipes had brought the customers. Doran said everything cooked under his roof belonged to him. So Evan stopped creating new dishes. For 3 days, he cooked only the standard menu exactly as written in Doran's old recipe book. Business fell immediately. On the 4th morning, Doran stormed into the kitchen, waving a ledger, and accused him of sabotage. Evan kept chopping cabbage. Doran demanded the new recipes. Evan said no. Doran threatened to throw him out with nothing. Evan put down the knife, washed his hands, walked upstairs, and returned with the cracked jar containing his savings. 37 copper now. Not much, but enough. He told Doran he accepted the offer. The owner's mouth remained open for several seconds. Doran had expected pleading. Evan took 2 knives that belonged to the original Evan, 1 wooden spoon, 3 sets of clothes, and a blanket. Doran tried to claim the knives belonged to the shop. Evan reminded him that the blades had the original Evan's initials scratched into the handles. Doran threatened to call the district guards. Evan invited him to do so. Doran did not. By noon, Evan was standing in the Western Market with his possessions wrapped in a blanket and 37 copper in his pocket. His confidence survived until he learned that even the smallest permanent stall required a 10 silver deposit. He sat on an overturned crate and reconsidered the wisdom of his dramatic exit. A vegetable seller named Mara, a broad-shouldered widow with red cheeks and the habit of shouting prices at people who were not shopping, had seen him buy ingredients for weeks. She asked whether Doran had finally thrown him out. Evan said the separation had been mutual. Mara said that was poor man's language for getting fired. He admitted that was close enough. She pointed him toward a narrow space between her vegetable stall and a cellar of clay pots. The market office rented temporary carts by the day. 4 copper for the cart, 2 copper for water, 1 copper for cleaning. 7 copper disappeared before he cooked anything. Evan bought noodles, onions, greens, chicken bones, and a small sack of grain with another 11. He had 19 copper left. If the day failed, he would be sleeping under the cart. The cart itself leaned left. 1 wheel squeaked, and its canopy had been repaired so many times that Evan could not identify the original fabric color. He loved it immediately. It was his. At least until sunset. He made a chicken and grain porridge using the bones for stock and the greens at the end. He priced it at 2 copper a bowl. Mara was his first customer. She ate, standing beside her vegetables, frowned, and told him he was charging too little. Evan said he needed people to try it. Mara shouted across the entire market that the idiot former cook from the copper ladle was selling the best porridge in the district for only 2 copper. Within half an hour, he had a line. Within 2 hours, he had no clean bowls. A potter from the next row lent him 10 in exchange for lunch. By late afternoon, Evan had 63 copper in his cash box. After expenses, it was more money than the original Evan had earned in a week. Then Lady Violet appeared. She stopped in front of a crooked cart and looked at the patched canopy. Evan told her reservations were difficult to obtain. She looked at the single stool beside the wheel. He said the private dining room was currently under renovation. She sat on the stool. Mara, who had been watching, whispered that Evan must have a death wish. Even in plain clothes, Lady Violet carried herself like someone accustomed to palaces. Evan served her porridge. She ate half the bowl before asking why he had left the copper ladle. Evan explained. She asked whether he wanted Doran punished. The question was too casual. Evan asked what kind of punishment she had in mind. Lady Violet considered it, then said Doran could lose the building. Evan asked how. She replied that ownership was a flexible concept. He decided not to pursue the subject. He told her Doran had done him a favor. This cart was ugly, but every coin earned here belonged to Evan after rent and supplies. Lady Violet looked at the line of workers waiting behind her. Her gaze lingered on Evan's hands as he portioned food, accepted money, adjusted seasoning, and remembered who had asked for no onion. She asked what he would do if the stall succeeded. Evan answered without hesitation. A proper kitchen first, then maybe 10 tables. Good knives, a stove that did not smoke into his face. Enough money to buy ingredients because they were interesting instead of because they were cheap. He paused, then added that he wanted to cook food people remembered. Lady Violet lowered her eyes to the porridge. She said people forgot most things eventually. Evan replied that hunger was considerate enough to return every day. She finished the bowl. The cart survived its first day, then its first week. Evan kept renting it instead of gambling everything on a permanent stall. For 3 weeks, he worked the market from dawn until the lamps were lit. building a small reserve, one bowl at a time. Mara helped him find vegetables that would still be good the next morning. The potter next door rented him extra bowls when the line grew. Lady Violet returned often enough that Evan stopped pretending her visits were accidental. And on the evenings she did not appear, he sometimes caught himself keeping one portion warm longer than necessary before becoming annoyed with himself. By the end of the third week, regular laborers knew his cart. Several guards had started buying breakfast there, and Evan had saved a little more than 6 silver after rent, food, and replacement utensils. It was still not enough for the 10 silver deposit on a permanent stall, but it was the first money in either life that had come from a kitchen he controlled himself. The next afternoon, trouble arrived on 4 legs. A merchant caravan had entered the market, carrying 3 low-grade spirit beasts in reinforced cages. The animals were destined for wealthy restaurants in the inner district. Most were harmless once restrained. One was not. The iron-tusked boar weighed nearly 600 pounds. Its gray hide was threaded with faint lines of red spiritual energy, and its tusks had been capped with leather to keep it from skewering handlers. Evan noticed the cage because the animal smelled strongly of wet earth and iron. The boar pressed its shoulder against the cage as Evan passed. A tuft of coarse gray bristle pushed between the bars and brushed his fingertips before he could pull his hand away. The system flashed information immediately. Iron tusk boar. Low-grade spirit beast. Edible portions, 78%. Natural property. Enhanced blood recovery. Mild physical restoration. Warning. Rage residue concentrated along spine and shoulder glands. Evan had just thought that wealthy cooks probably paid well for the meat when the boar slammed into the cage. One hinge tore free. The handler shouted. The boar hit the gate again. The second hinge snapped. People ran. The animal burst into the market. A normal wild boar was dangerous. This one could crack paving stones under its hooves. It struck a fruit stall and turned the cart into splinters. A cultivator from the market guard leaped from a roof, sword drawn, and slashed across the beast's shoulder. The blade cut hide, but failed to stop it. The boar screamed and charged blindly. Evan saw a child frozen in the lane ahead. He moved before thinking. He grabbed the child by the back of her coat and pulled her between 2 stalls. The boar passed close enough that one tusk tore Evan's sleeve. Mara shoved the child behind a vegetable crate and shouted at Evan to get down. 3 guards had arrived now. They were stronger than ordinary people, probably body-tempering cultivators from what Evan understood of the local ranks. Strong enough to leap 10 feet and break bricks, not strong enough to casually stop 600 pounds of furious spirit beast. Their attacks made the boar angrier. Evan watched it turn. The creature's small eyes barely seemed to track the swordsman. Its snout moved constantly. The animal was following scent. Boars relied heavily on smell, even on earth. This one had just been cut. Blood, panic, spices, fruit, smoke. The market was an explosion of scent. Evan looked toward his cart. He had half a jar of fermented fish sauce, chicken fat, and a bucket of vegetable scraps. He ran. Mara called him an idiot. He agreed internally. At the cart, he dumped the fish sauce into the scrap bucket, added chicken fat, then grabbed the whole disgusting mixture. The boar knocked a guard across the street. Evan shouted to the remaining 2 that he could pull it toward the empty livestock lane. One guard demanded to know how. Evan threw a handful of the mixture against a wall near the boar. Its head snapped toward the smell. Good. He splashed a second trail farther away. The boar turned. One guard understood immediately. He stopped attacking and instead used the flat of his blade to pressure the animal from the opposite side. Evan ran backward, tossing the foul mixture in a rough trail. The boar followed. It was much faster than he expected, fast enough to make his weak body painfully relevant. He barely made the livestock lane before the animal closed the distance. A hoof clipped the bucket from his hand. Evan fell. The boar lowered its tusks. Then a spear slammed through the paving stones directly in front of its face. The beast recoiled. A woman with dark red hair, braided to her waist, dropped from the roof. She wore the black and gold armor of the Imperial Guard. Her spear swept once, striking the boar behind its front leg where the previous guards had already wounded it. The animal stumbled. The market guards attacked together. One cut the rear tendon, another struck the neck. The red-haired woman drove her spear into the chest. The fight ended in seconds after that, because trained cultivators had finally forced the beast into a narrow lane where it could not build speed. Evan sat on the ground, holding an empty bucket. The red-haired woman looked at him. She asked whether he was the fool who had used fish sauce as a combat technique. Evan said, technically, the fish sauce had been bait. She told him that was not an improvement. Her name was Captain Mira Tal, commander of an Imperial Guard patrol responsible for the outer market that day. When the beast's owner arrived shouting about compensation, Mira informed him that a broken cage had endangered civilians and that the carcass would be sold to cover damages. Evan raised one hand. He offered 8 silver for the damaged shoulder and hindquarter. The merchant laughed until Mira looked at him. 10 minutes later, Evan owned almost 90 pounds of iron tusk boar for 6 silver, with the rest auctioned to larger buyers. 6 silver was nearly all the money he had accumulated over 3 weeks. Mara told him he had finally gone insane. Evan looked at the meat. The system showed him exactly where the rage residue lay. He smiled. That night, the market stayed open late with the market master's permission. 90 pounds was too much for 1 weak cook and 1 crooked cart. So Evan paid the potter next door 2 copper to borrow a second charcoal brazier and traded Mara dinner for 2 hours of chopping help. 2 teenage porters, who regularly ate at his cart, carried salted water and washed skewers in exchange for their meals. Evan handled every dangerous step himself. He removed the shoulder glands, bled the meat in cold salted water, and checked each batch before anyone else touched it. Then, the helpers sliced vegetables and threaded portions while he grilled the meat with ginger and sour plum glaze. The dangerous spiritual residue faded under the proper preparation, while the natural restorative quality remained. A plate cost 8 copper, expensive for ordinary market food, but cheap for freshly cooked spirit beast meat. Miratal returned with 6 guards. They had spent the afternoon filling reports and treating bruises. Evan gave them the first plates it cost. Mira took 1 bite and stopped talking. A guard beside her ate 3 slices before realizing his aching shoulder had loosened slightly. The effect was modest, but real. Warmth spread through exhausted muscles. The meat replenished blood and energy exactly as the system had predicted. People noticed. By the end of the night, Evan had sold every edible portion. His 6 silver investment returned 21 silver after expenses. Mira leaned against the cart afterward, looking at the stripped bones. She told him most cooks ruined iron tusk boar unless they had fire cultivation. Evan asked whether she was complimenting him. Mira said she was gathering evidence. He asked for what crime. She said making Imperial guards fight over the last skewer. Behind her, 2 soldiers were doing exactly that. One was Senior Guard Harlan Vey, a broad-shouldered veteran with a crooked nose and the deeply serious expression of a man defending national security with a meat skewer. Mira turned and shouted that Harlan was supposed to set an example. He replied that he was setting an example of decisive action. Lady Violet arrived during the argument. She looked at Mira. Mira looked at her. Every trace of humor left the captain's face. She dropped to 1 knee so fast that her armor struck the paving stones. The other guards followed. The entire market seemed to inhale at once. Evan slowly turned toward Lady Violet. She had closed her eyes. Mira said, "Your Majesty." Evan looked at the patched stall, then at the silver-haired woman, then at the Imperial Guard captain, kneeling in spilled charcoal dust. He asked whether Lady Violet was actually the Immortal Empress. Mira's head came up in horror at the name Lady Violet. The woman opened her eyes. Her expression suggested she had been hoping to delay this conversation indefinitely. She told the guards to rise. Mira obeyed, still staring at Evan as if he had casually called a dragon by a childhood nickname. Evan crossed his arms. He said the Empress could have mentioned this earlier. She replied that he had never asked. Mira made a sound somewhere between a cough and a prayer. The next morning, an imperial carriage arrived at Evan's crooked cart. It was black, lacquered wood edged in gold, pulled by 4 white-scaled horses, and guarded by 20 soldiers. Mara stood beside her cabbages, with both hands on her hips. She told Evan that if he became rich, he still owed her for the 10 bulls she had lent him. Evan promised to return all 10. Mara said she wanted 12 now because of interest. Evan climbed into the carriage, laughing. For the first time since waking in this world, he passed through the gates of the inner capital. The streets widened. Stone houses became walled estates. Spiritual lanterns glowed even in daylight. Cultivators in clan robes crossed high bridges between towers. Far ahead, the imperial palace rose above the city in terraces of white stone and dark blue roofs. Evan stared through the carriage window. He had wanted a proper kitchen. Apparently, the universe had misunderstood the scale of the request. The Immortal Empress's full name was Lysandra Vera. Evan learned it from Captain Mira, who spent the carriage ride giving him the shortest etiquette lesson in imperial history. There were 12 major noble clans, 7 ministries, 4 levels of formal bow, 3 situations in which looking directly at the Empress was considered improper, 2 situations in which speaking before being addressed could legally be treated as contempt. Evan asked whether there was a rule about serving overcooked meat. Mira stared at him. He said he was trying to understand the palace's priorities. Mira informed him that if he spoke to Her Majesty the way he had in the market, etiquette would become the least of his problems. Evan pointed out that Her Majesty kept returning. Mira opened her mouth, then closed it. Evan took that as a victory, and wisely did not press for another. Lysandra waited for him in a small receiving room rather than the throne hall. In imperial clothing, she looked even less like the traveler who had sat on a market stool. Her silver-white hair was pinned partly back with a black jade crown. The golden crescent at her forehead was no ornament. Up close, Evan could see fine lines of light moving inside it, like liquid sunlight. Her violet eyes were the same. She offered him a position as personal cook. The salary was 20 gold a month. Evan thought he had misheard. 20 gold was more than Doran would earn in several years. He asked what she expected in return. Breakfast when requested. Evening meals when she was in the palace. Banquets on occasion. Discretion. Quality. He asked whether he would be free to leave the palace on market days. She said yes, with guards. He asked whether anyone could force him to cook spoiled ingredients. Her eyes narrowed, perhaps remembering their first meeting. She said no. He asked whether he could choose his own suppliers. Yes. He asked whether the kitchen tools were included. Lysandra looked toward Mira. Mira looked toward the ceiling. Apparently no candidate for imperial service had ever negotiated access to knives before discussing title or rank. Lysandra said he could use whatever tools he needed. Evan accepted. Then she added one condition. He was not to call her Lady Violet in public. Evan said that seemed reasonable. Mira exhaled. Evan added that he might still use it in private if she annoyed him. Lysandra's mouth curved. She told Mira to show him the kitchen. The imperial kitchen occupied an entire stone building connected to the main palace by covered corridors. It contained 6 cooking halls, cold storage rooms lined with frost crystals, dry stores larger than the copper ladle, and a locked spiritual pantry guarded by 2 cultivators. Evan stepped inside the main hall and nearly forgot to breathe. Copper pans hung from polished racks. Knives of every shape filled magnetic boards. 3 stone ovens were heated by controlled fire arrays. A central preparation table had a surface so smooth he wanted to apologize before putting anything on it. Then a man with iron-gray hair and shoulders like a butcher's block walked toward him. Master Garrick Morn had been chief imperial cook for 32 years. He wore dark blue robes with silver embroidery, and the scar along his jaw suggested he had not spent all 32 years safely behind a stove. He looked Evan up and down. Then he asked which culinary academy had trained him. Evan said none. Which spiritual flame did he command? What was his cultivation rank? Evan hesitated. The original body's rank was technically first breath, the stage children often reached before adolescence. Garrick's brows drew together. He asked whether Evan was joking. Evan said he preferred jokes with better timing. Garrick turned toward Mira. He said the Empress had brought him an uncultivated market cook. Mira replied that the Empress had brought Garrick a personal cook, which meant Garrick's opinion was professionally relevant and politically useless. Garrick grunted. He was not insulting for the pleasure of it. Evan could see the genuine offense underneath. This man had dedicated his life to his craft. Then the ruler he served had returned from the poor district with some skinny stranger and given him access to the imperial pantry. Evan would have been angry too. So when Garrick proposed a test, Evan accepted. The ingredient was moon pheasant. A servant placed 2 identical breasts of pale blue meat on separate boards. The instant Evan touched his portion, text appeared. Moon pheasant breast. Grade, low spiritual. Natural property, calming spiritual circulation. Primary risk, energy loss under high heat. Optimal preparation, low temperature sear, covered rest, bright acid finish. Warning. Direct spiritual flame causes rapid dissipation. Evan glanced at Garrick's station. The chief cook had already summoned a blue-white flame above his palm. Interesting. Garrick moved beautifully. There was no other word for it. His knife work was precise. His control of heat, almost surgical. He wrapped the pheasant in fragrant leaves, brushed it with a sauce made from 3 spiritual fruits, and used his flame to cook the meat evenly from all sides. Evan did something much simpler. He salted the pheasant lightly and let it rest. He heated an iron pan over ordinary charcoal, rendered a small amount of bird fat, then seared the breast slowly. He covered it for part of the cook, removed it before the center was fully done, and allowed retained heat to finish the meat. The system gave exact temperatures in a form his mind somehow understood through touch and color, rather than numbers. He made a sauce from sour cloudberries and a little honey. Garrick's dish looked imperial. Evan's looked like dinner. Lysandra tasted Garrick's first. She nodded. It was clearly excellent. Then she tasted Evan's. Her hand stopped. Garrick noticed. He tasted it himself, without waiting to be invited. For several seconds, the kitchen was silent, except for the hiss of cooling pans. Garrick cut another slice. He chewed slowly. Then he looked at his own plate. He asked Evan why he had avoided spiritual flame. Evan said the meat was delicate. Too much energy drove out what made it valuable. Garrick frowned and tasted his own dish again. Garrick's finished plate carried more total spiritual force because the luminous fruit and sauce added energy of their own. The pheasant itself had lost more of its delicate natural essence to the direct spiritual flame, and its calming quality sat roughly in the sauce, instead of remaining integrated through the meat. He asked how Evan had known. Evan could not tell him about the system, so he gave the most truthful answer available. The meat changed smell when it got too hot. Garrick stared at him for a long time. Then he said, that answer was infuriating. Evan agreed. Lysandra chose Evan's dish for dinner. Garrick did not congratulate him. He also did not insult him again. Instead, he ordered a servant to clear a small side kitchen that had been used for pastries, and told Evan he could work there. It was 20 times larger than the market cart. Evan walked around it in silence. 2 stoves, a stone sink supplied by a water rune, proper refrigeration, storage cabinets, a prep table, a window overlooking an inner garden. He ran his palm over the wooden counter. This was not his kitchen. It belonged to the palace. But for the first time in either life, someone had handed him a professional space and said, use it as you see fit. He slept badly that night because his mind kept rearranging the shelves. Palace life quickly proved stranger than market life. On his 3rd day, Evan entered a small council dining room carrying soup and found 12 ministers seated around a table. An empty chair stood nearest the service door. He put down the tray, sat in it, and began checking whether the bowls were hot enough. Every minister stared at him. Evan asked if something was wrong. An elderly man in green robes informed him that he was sitting in the Chancellor of Revenue's chair. Evan looked at the chair, then at the service door. He said the Chancellor had excellent taste in locations. Lysandra arrived before anyone decided whether this was treason. She took one look at Evan in the Chancellor's seat and told the Chancellor to sit somewhere else. For the next week, half the palace believed Evan was a secret political favorite. The truth was that the chair was close to the kitchen. Another incident began with roasted duck. Lysandra had developed the irritating habit of appearing in Evan's kitchen before meals. She said the small room was quieter than her private chambers. Evan suspected she also enjoyed stealing pieces before he plated them. One evening, she reached past him for a strip of crisp duck skin. Evan slapped the back of her hand with his chopsticks. Steele whispered behind him. 4 guards had drawn swords. Captain Mira covered her face with one hand. Evan turned slowly. He asked whether the guards intended to fight him over duck skin. One young guard looked as though he wished the floor would open. Lysandra examined the faint red mark on her hand. Then she told them to put the swords away, because she had, in fact, touched food before it was served. Mira's shoulders shook once. Evan suspected she was laughing, and valued his life too much to mention it. The small kitchen became Lysandra's unofficial refuge. She would arrive after court, remove the black jade crown, and sit at the corner of his prep table while he worked. Some nights, she spoke about state matters in broad terms. Drought in the western counties, disputes between merchant clans, repairs to a fortress road. Evan rarely had solutions. He had been a cook, not a ruler, but he listened. And because he did not need anything from her beyond payment and access to ingredients, he sometimes said things no courtier would. When she complained that 3 ministers had spent an hour arguing over which clan should supply grain to the army, Evan asked why the contract did not simply go to whichever supplier could deliver the grain cheapest without poisoning anyone. Lysandra said politics complicated things. Evan said hunger had a talent for simplifying them again. She gave him a long look and changed the subject. 2 days later, the Army Procurement Office announced a blind quality inspection for grain contracts. Evan chose not to ask whether he had caused it. Weeks passed. The food improved his body gradually, because Evan ate the same balanced meals he prepared for others. His wrists stopped aching from lifting pots. The faint spiritual energy and palace ingredients slowly strengthened his weak first breath cultivation without any dramatic breakthrough. Captain Mira began forcing him to exercise in the courtyard every morning. Her reasoning was practical. If he was going to travel with imperial convoys, he needed to run farther than one angry boar. On the first morning, Evan lasted 6 minutes. Mira informed him that this was embarrassing. Evan told her his profession generally involved stationary fire. By the 3rd week, he could run the full courtyard circuit without tasting blood. He was still weak compared with any trained guard. That fact became important when the border army returned. The northern campaign had ended after a 3-week clash with raiders backed by a minor sect. 700 imperial guards marched through the capital gates. Nearly 200 carried injuries. The palace planned a formal victory banquet for officers. Evan watched the wounded soldiers enter the outer courtyard and asked Garrick what the enlisted guards would eat. Garrick said the barracks kitchen had already prepared grain stew. Evan looked at men with bandaged arms and gray faces. He asked how many moon pheasants the palace had in storage. Garrick stared at him. Evan knew that look now. It meant the chief cook had detected an expensive idea. Garrick said 32. Evan asked about iron root, red dates, marrow bones, and winter greens. Garrick folded his arms. He wanted to know what Evan was planning. Evan looked toward the soldiers. Dinner. The palace had enough food to feed 700 soldiers. What it did not have was enough time to turn that food into anything worth eating. Garrick explained the problem while Evan walked through the stores. The wounded guards had returned 2 days earlier than expected. The formal officer banquet could be delayed until evening. 700 hungry soldiers could not. The barracks kitchen had 4 large cauldrons, 12 cooks, and no access to the imperial pantry without authorization. Evan asked for authorization. Garrick told him it would cost roughly 40 gold in ingredients. Evan had been earning imperial wages for less than a month. 40 gold still sounded like someone had attached a house price to soup. Lysandra approved it before he could reconsider. Her only question was whether it would help. Evan said yes. She signed the order. The order taught Evan something useful about imperial economics. A ruler could spend 40 gold quickly, but a competent ruler still wanted to know why. The available ingredients were not miraculous. Marrow bones from low-grade spirit cattle, iron root, a common medicinal vegetable that encouraged blood production, winter greens, ginger, red dates, moon pheasant scraps from the palace stores, coarse rice from the military depot. The system displayed the properties of each ingredient separately. The challenge was not the recipe. The challenge was scale. Evan could make one pot perfect by himself. He could not personally chop 700 portions of vegetables, skim 4 cauldrons, roast bones, monitor rice, portion meat, and serve before midnight. His first attempt to control everything lasted 20 minutes. He moved from stove to stove correcting temperatures, stopped one cook from overwashing the rice, ran back to the bone ovens, then discovered that another helper had added all the iron root at once instead of in stages. Evan snapped at him. The young cook stiffened and nearly dropped the ladle. Garrick watched from across the room. He said nothing until Evan found the next mistake. Then Garrick asked whether Evan intended to cook 700 bowls alone. Evan replied that he intended to make sure they were cooked correctly. Garrick asked again, more slowly. Evan stopped. The kitchen around him was full of trained people waiting for instructions. He was treating them like unreliable hands because the system gave information only to him. That would never work beyond a market cart. He took a breath and changed the plan. Instead of controlling every task, he identified the steps where precision mattered most. Bone roasting, timing the iron root, the final balance of salt and ginger, the point when the moon pheasant scraps entered the broth. Everything else could be standardized. He gave one cook responsibility for rice, another for washing greens, 2 for cutting. Garrick took charge of the cauldron teams and repeated Evan's instructions in the clipped language of someone accustomed to commanding kitchens. The room changed almost immediately. Knives began striking boards in a steady rhythm. Trays moved instead of piling up. Evan stopped running in circles and started checking the critical stages. At one point, he noticed that the broth in the 3rd cauldron had developed a bitter edge. The system identified the cause. Someone had scorched a batch of iron root. His first instinct was to discard the whole pot. Garrick tasted it and asked whether the bitterness could be separated. Evan checked the ingredients again. A small amount of sweet river pear would bind the bitter compounds if simmered briefly. They tried it on 1 ladleful. It worked. The mistake cost them 15 minutes instead of an entire cauldron. Evan filed away another lesson. Perfect information did not require a perfect kitchen. By sunset, the barracks yard smelled of roasted marrow and ginger. Evan expected the officers to take the first servings. Captain Mira made the commander stand at the back. One general objected. Mira reminded him that he could wait 10 minutes without dying, and that several men in front of him had spent the previous night bleeding through bandages. The general took his place in line. The stew did not close wounds. It did not repair broken bones. It gave exhausted bodies exactly what the ingredients naturally offered: warmth, protein, minerals, mild spiritual nourishment. Iron root supported blood recovery. The moon pheasant eased rough spiritual circulation after heavy cultivation. Soldiers who had been too nauseated to eat grain stew managed full bowls. A young guard with his left arm in a sling stared into his empty bowl and asked whether palace food was always like this. Mira told him absolutely not, and that he should enjoy the accident. Garrick heard her and threatened to assign her raw turnips at every future banquet. Mira replied that she had eaten military rations for 12 years and no longer feared him. For once, Garrick smiled. Evan stood near the serving tables and watched the yard empty slowly. This was different from one perfect plate. His food had reached hundreds of people because other cooks had helped him. The realization felt better than the applause he had received in the imperial kitchen. Lysandra arrived without ceremony after dark. She had changed from court robes into a simple black dress, though the crescent mark on her forehead still made disguise pointless to anyone who knew her. She asked whether there was any stew left. Evan said one bowl. Mira immediately claimed she had not eaten. Garrick said she had consumed 3 portions while inspecting quality. Mira said inspection required sacrifice. Lysandra took the final bowl. Mira looked personally betrayed. Evan handed her a heel of bread as compensation. 2 days later, the palace kitchen received an order for a large shipment of fresh frost leaf and silverhorn venison from a royal preserve north of the capital. The goods were needed for a diplomatic dinner at the end of the week. Normally, Evan would not have traveled with the convoy. Garrick could judge quality, but several recent deliveries of spiritual meat had arrived with unstable residue after being transported too warm. Evan wanted to examine the storage process himself. Mira approved the trip on one condition. Evan had to stay with the guards. He said, of course. Mira asked whether he understood that following a dangerous animal with a bucket did not count as staying with the guards. Evan said that incident had ended successfully. Mira replied that falling in front of a boar was not a recognized military technique. The convoy left at dawn, with 3 wagons, 12 guards, Mira, Evan, and 2 palace buyers. The preserve lay a day north, through wooded hills where low-grade spirit beasts were common. The Imperial Road was safe enough that merchants traveled it alone during daylight, but fresh venison attracted predators. Evan spent most of the morning learning about transport. Spiritual meat heated from within after death. If packed too tightly, the residual energy spoiled it faster. The palace buyers used cooling stones between layers of cloth. Evan tested several arrangements with the system and discovered that spacing the stones unevenly created cold pockets that damaged texture. By lunch, he had reorganized half the wagon. Mira watched him move cooling stones for the 4th time and asked whether every object in his life eventually became part of a kitchen. Evan said wagons were simply kitchens with worse floors. They reached the preserve safely, collected the venison, packed frost leaf, and began the return trip the following morning. The attack came in the narrowest part of the forest road. A gray shape struck the lead horse from the brush. The animal screamed. Mira's spear was in her hand before Evan understood what he had seen. 3 dusk wolves emerged on the left side of the road. Then 4 more appeared between the trees on the right. These were not ordinary animals. Each stood nearly to Evan's chest, at the shoulder. Black mist clung to their fur. Their eyes reflected dull green spiritual light. Mira shouted for the wagons to form a triangle. Guards took positions between the wheels. Evan climbed down from the second wagon because remaining on top would turn him into an elevated snack. A wolf lunged. A guard met it with a shield. The impact drove him backward into the wagon, hard enough to crack wood. Mira killed the animal with one thrust through the throat. The others did not retreat. More shapes moved in the trees. A pack, probably drawn by the venison. Mira was stronger than any single wolf. So were several of her guards. The problem was numbers and terrain. The animals attacked from multiple directions, disappearing into brush before the guards could pursue. One wolf leaped over a wagon wheel and slashed a driver across the thigh. Evan dragged the man beneath the wagon before the animal could bite again. A guard cut the wolf across the ribs. It vanished into the trees. The wounded driver was bleeding heavily. Evan tied a strip of cloth above the wound and pressed another against the cut. He was not a healer, but Kitchens had taught him enough first aid to know pressure mattered more than panic. Mira shouted that the pack was circling toward the rear wagon. Evan smelled venison. Blood from the fresh carcasses dripped onto the road. Inside were spices, lamp oil, salt, and 2 sacks of dried pepper, meant for the palace stores. Mira saw him and demanded to know what he was doing. Evan shouted that wolves lived through their noses. He ripped open the sack and dumped dried pepper into a shallow iron roasting tray. Then he added a splash of lamp oil. Not enough to burn violently, only enough to make thick smoke when heated. One of the palace buyers understood. He had a small fire talisman for camp stoves. They lit the tray. Pepper smoke rolled low across the rear approach. The first wolf entering it sneezed violently and veered away. A second backed off, shaking its head. It did not stop the pack, but it closed one direction of attack. She moved 2 guards from the rear to the exposed left side. Now the soldiers could concentrate. The wolves changed tactics. 3 attacked the lead at once, while 2 smaller animals slipped beneath the wagons. Evan saw one heading for the wounded driver. He had no sword skill worth mentioning. He did have a long carving fork from the supply chest. He put himself between the wolf and the driver, which he recognized as a terrible plan even while doing it. The wolf lunged. Evan thrust the fork toward its face, not trying to kill it, only to force hesitation. The animal snapped at the metal. The impact nearly tore the tool from his hands. Evan stumbled backward. The wolf came again. Then a spear shaft struck it from the side. Mira had thrown the weapon rather than abandon her position. The shaft hit the ribs and knocked the wolf beneath a wheel. A guard finished it. Mira shouted at Evan to stop trying to become heroic in ways his muscles could not support. Evan shouted back that he had been protecting the injured man. Mira told him to protect people from behind something solid. The pack leader finally appeared. It was larger, with a white scar across its muzzle and darker mist pouring from the fur along its spine. It did not charge immediately. It watched. Evan noticed something else. Several younger wolves stayed deeper in the forest, yipping nervously. This pack was hunting food, not territory. The fresh venison had drawn them close to the road. Evan looked at the torn carcass. If they kept defending 3 wagons full of meat, the wolves had every reason to continue. He shouted an idea to Mira. She hated it immediately. Evan wanted to sacrifice 1 damaged venison quarter, drag it down the slope using a rope, and draw the wolves into a narrower gully where guards could control the fight. Mira asked whether he had become emotionally attached to using food as a weapon. Evan said he preferred the term ingredient management. There was no time for a better plan. They tied rope around the largest bleeding quarter. 2 guards threw it off the right side of the road, then pulled it along the slope while retreating behind trees. The scent shifted. The younger wolves moved first. The scarred leader barked sharply, but hunger and blood pulled several animals after the meat. Mira waited until half the pack entered the gully. Then she moved. This fight was not long, because it did not need to be. Mira was a high-level cultivator, fighting low-grade beasts in terrain she had chosen. She dropped from the road, recovered her spear, and crossed the gully in a burst of red spiritual light. The first wolf died before it turned. A guard pinned the second against a tree. The scarred leader lunged from above, faster than the others. Mira blocked with the spear shaft, slid backward through mud, then rotated under its weight and drove the blade upward through the chest. The remaining wolves broke. She did not chase them, neither did the guards. The pack fled toward the younger animals in the forest. Evan sat beside the wagon and finally noticed his left forearm burning. A claw had opened a shallow cut when the wolf struck the carving fork. Mira walked over, covered in mud and wolf blood. She looked at the wound, then at him. She said nothing for several seconds. Evan told her it was small. Mira said she was deciding whether to inform the Empress before or after they returned. Evan suggested never. Mira laughed directly in his face. Lysandra met the convoy outside the northern gate. Only then did Evan understand that Mira had used a communication talisman hours earlier. The Empress appeared in the road with 6 elite guards and enough spiritual pressure to make every horse lower its head. Her violet eyes went directly to Evan's bandaged arm. Evan looked at Mira. Mira studied the clouds. Lysandra asked, "What happened?" Evan gave a concise version. Wolves, wagon, pepper, minor wound. Mira added that Evan had attempted to defend a wounded driver with a carving fork. Evan reminded her that the fork had worked for almost 2 seconds. Lysandra walked closer. Her fingers touched the bandage carefully. The air around her grew colder. Somewhere in the forest, Birds exploded from the trees. Evan realized she was angry enough to consider turning the northern woodland into a geographical memory. He told her the wolves were already gone. She asked whether any remained. Probably many, he admitted. Her gaze moved toward the forest. Evan added that if she killed every spirit beast in the preserve, the palace would have to import meat from 3 provinces away. Lysandra looked back at him. Mira made a strangled noise. Evan explained that his injury was shallow, and the pack had attacked because the convoy smelled like fresh venison. There was no reason to punish an entire forest. Lysandra's jaw relaxed slowly. She told Mira that any future trip outside the city would require a stronger escort and advance route reports. Then, she told Evan there would be no more casual convoy trips until he could defend himself better. If ingredients ever forced him somewhere genuinely dangerous, she would approve the expedition herself, and Mira would set the conditions. Evan objected that he was a cook. She said exactly. That night, she came to his side kitchen after the palace physician had cleaned the wound. Evan was slicing pears one-handed. Lysandra took the knife away. He told her that was theft. She set it on the far side of the table. He asked whether she planned to cut the pears herself. She looked at the knife, then at the pear. Evan realized with some horror that the ruler of the empire might not know how. He asked whether she had ever peeled fruit. She said servants had existed before him. Evan retrieved a second knife and showed her how. Her first strip of peel was thick enough to qualify as lumber. He told her she had murdered half the pear. She informed him that she could split a mountain. He said the pear remained unimpressed. She almost smiled, but her hands were tense. After a while, she asked why he had stayed with the wounded driver instead of running. Evan said the man could not move. Lysandra replied that Evan could have died. He did not make a speech about heroism. He simply said that leaving someone under a wagon to be eaten would have made dinner difficult to enjoy later. Her eyes lowered to the pear. That answer seemed to affect her more than he expected. A servant interrupted them with a sealed message from the southern border. Lysandra read it once. The warmth left her face. Prince Cassian Solvar of the Radiant Dynasty was traveling to the capital with a diplomatic delegation. Evan recognized the name from court gossip. Cassian was heir to a neighboring immortal state and one of the strongest cultivators of his generation. Golden eyes, famous sword, excellent teeth, according to 3 palace maids who had discussed him while Evan was trying to find a sack of onions. More importantly, the Radiant Dynasty had spent years pushing for a political marriage between Cassian and Lysandra. Lysandra had never agreed. Several great clans had behaved as though the marriage was inevitable anyway. Evan asked when Cassian would arrive. Lysandra said 12 days. Then, she looked at his bandaged arm and told him to stay out of the forest. Evan asked what one subject had to do with the other. She said nothing, and took another pear. Her second attempt was better. Prince Cassian Solvar entered the capital beneath banners of red and gold. Evan saw the procession from a kitchen balcony because Garrick insisted that every senior cook understand the scale of the delegation they would feed. There were 200 attendants, 80 guards, 6 clan elders, 3 diplomatic ministers, and 1 enormous crimson carriage drawn by horned spirit horses. Cassian rode instead of using the carriage. The palace maids had been accurate about the hair. It was deep red, almost metallic in sunlight, pulled back from a face that looked carefully designed for statues. His eyes were bright gold. A narrow scar crossed his right eyebrow. He wore white armor edged in red and carried a sword whose spiritual pressure Evan could feel from the balcony. Evan decided the man looked exhausting. Beside Cassian rode another figure who interested him more. Chef Gianvaro was thin, elegant, and dressed in white culinary robes embroidered with gold flame patterns. His long black hair was tied with a red cord. 3 small fire crystals floated above his shoulder in a controlled orbit. Garrick identified him quietly. Gian was the Radiant Dynasty's highest-ranked immortal chef. He had cooked for sect masters, royalty, and beings older than the capital itself. His control of spiritual flame was famous. Evan asked whether he was actually good. Garrick gave him an offended look. Of course he was good. Evan said, "That was useful. Beating incompetent people taught nothing." Garrick's expression changed slightly. He told Evan not to say that where Jian could hear, unless he intended to prove it. The first formal banquet passed without incident. Evan did not cook for the delegation. Garrick led the palace kitchen, while Evan prepared Lysandra's private meal afterward. That was deliberate. Lysandra had no desire to turn him into a diplomatic attraction before necessary. Cassian changed that on the second day. During a council meal, he noticed Lysandra eating a simple bowl of fish soup after refusing 3 elaborate dishes from the formal table. He asked who had prepared it. Lysandra answered honestly, her personal cook. Cassian asked to meet him. Evan was summoned with the dessert tray. The council chamber contained more wealth than the entire Western market. Polished black stone, gold screens, ministers in embroidered robes, spirit lamps burning without smoke. Evan entered carrying pear cakes. Cassian looked at him. The prince's expression remained polite, but Evan saw the surprise. He had expected an elderly master. Instead, he found a lean young man with dark cobalt hair cut just below the ears, one natural silver streak above the right temple, and amber eyes. The body Evan inherited had always possessed unusual coloring, but proper food had sharpened it. His shoulders were broader now. He still looked mortal beside the cultivators in the room, but no longer sickly. Cassian asked his name. Evan answered. The prince asked which clan he belonged to. None. Which academy? None. Cultivation rank? Evan said, first breath. Several ministers looked uncomfortable. Cassian glanced at Lysandra. He asked whether this was a joke. Lysandra said, no. Cassian requested a pear cake. Evan handed him one. The prince tasted it. His golden eyes narrowed slightly. He was not dismissive enough to pretend it was poor. He said Evan had talent. Evan thanked him. Then, Cassian asked whether talent was the reason Lysandra spent so much time in the small kitchen wing. The room became quiet. Lysandra's gaze cooled. She said her schedule was not part of the diplomatic agenda. Cassian smiled and changed the subject, but the question had already entered the room. Over the next several days, pressure built around the palace. Ministers who had never cared about Evan began finding reasons to inspect food service. Clan representatives sent gifts. One merchant offered Evan a townhouse if he agreed to exclusive ingredient purchases. Another sent a jade knife worth more than his annual salary. Evan returned everything. The jade knife nearly broke his heart. Garrick approved. He said gifts from nobles were rarely gifts. Evan replied that this was unfortunate, because it had been an excellent knife. The political issue arrived formally. On the 6th day, Cassian requested a marriage council. Evan was not present at first. He was in the side kitchen preparing a late lunch when Mira entered and told him to bring the food personally. He asked why. Mira said because Her Majesty had just made several ministers reconsider their career choices, and a meal might prevent casualties. Evan carried the tray to the council hall. Cassian stood near the center. Lysandra sat on the raised throne platform. The great clan ministers lined both sides. A treaty document lay open on the table. Cassian was speaking about unity between the Veyron Empire and the Radiant Dynasty. Shared borders, mutual defense, trade. The marriage proposal had apparently been attached to those benefits for years. Lysandra told him for the 3rd time that she would not marry him. Cassian remained composed. He asked whether she objected to him personally or to marriage itself. Lysandra said the distinction was irrelevant. One elderly minister made the mistake of suggesting that the Empress owed the Empire a stable succession arrangement. The pressure in the hall increased enough to make the lamps flicker. Evan entered at that moment, carrying soup. He considered backing out. Mira, behind him, quietly blocked the door with her foot. Cowardice had apparently been removed from the menu. Something in the prince's expression changed. He asked Lysandra whether there was someone else she considered more suitable. The question was aimed like a blade. Several ministers looked toward Evan before Lysandra did. That told Evan the gossip had spread farther than he realized. Lysandra's eyes settled on him. She said yes. Then she pointed. Evan looked behind himself. There was nobody there. A nervous sound moved through the ministers. Cassian's face did not change, but his hand tightened once around the edge of the table. He asked whether Lysandra was serious. She said completely. The elderly succession minister nearly swallowed his tongue. Someone whispered that Evan was mortal. Another said he had no clan. A third whispered that he was a cook. Evan set the soup on the table because his arms had started to feel ridiculous. He asked Lysandra whether she might have forgotten to discuss something with him. Mira made a tiny choking sound behind him. Lysandra said they were discussing it now. Evan looked around at the dozens of officials. He said this appeared to be an announcement. A younger minister stared at the floor to hide a smile. Cassian's composure cracked for the first time. He said Lysandra could not seriously compare a first-breath kitchen servant to the heir of an immortal dynasty. He said nobody had asked him to compare them. Cassian's golden eyes turned toward him. Evan felt spiritual pressure roll across the room. Not enough to attack. Enough to remind him exactly how far apart their strength was. His knees threatened to bend. He braced one hand against the serving table. Lysandra's aura rose instantly. Cassian withdrew his pressure. The air settled. Evan looked at the soup bowls. One had spilled. He told Cassian that if he wanted to intimidate someone, he should do it away from lunch. Mira turned her face toward the wall. Cassian laughed once, without humor. He told Lysandra they would continue the discussion privately. There was nothing to continue. The council ended shortly afterward. Evan waited until every minister and foreign envoy had gone. Then he turned to Lysandra. He asked whether she had lost her mind. Mira immediately stepped into the corridor and shut the door from outside. Lysandra remained seated. She said the marriage claim solved the diplomatic pressure. Evan said it had also apparently involved marrying him, which he considered an important detail. She said he was free to refuse. He stared at her. Then why announce it first? Her answer came after a pause. Because she was accustomed to making decisions. Evan rubbed his face. He told her he could sign contracts as a cook. He could negotiate salary. He could agree to live in the palace. Marriage was different. Lysandra's eyes narrowed. She asked whether he found the idea unpleasant. That was not the question, he said. She stood. For a moment she looked more dangerous than she had facing Cassian. Evan realized she was embarrassed and had no experience being embarrassed. That almost made the situation worse. He said quietly that if she wanted a husband, she had to ask a man, not issue a state decision. Lysandra replied that emperors did not ask. Evan said that might explain why emperors had so few honest friends. Her jaw tightened. He expected anger. Instead, she walked out. For the rest of the day, she did not come to his kitchen. That had never happened since Evan entered the palace. He told himself he was relieved. At dinner, he prepared 2 bowls out of habit. One remained untouched. The following evening, she came. No formal robes. Her silver hair was loose, falling nearly to her waist. She wore the same simple black cloak she had used in the market. Evan was cleaning the stove. She sat on the old wooden stool he kept near the window. For several minutes, neither spoke. Then, Lysandra told him why she had started leaving the palace disguised. Centuries of cultivation had made her powerful enough that ordinary meals barely registered. Palace chefs responded by adding more spiritual energy. Court gatherings turned eating into ceremony. Every person at her table wanted rank, permission, alliance, favor, or fear. She had gone to the outer district because she wanted to walk somewhere nobody bowed. Then a rude cook made her stand in line behind an old man counting copper coins. Evan said the old man had been very slow. Lysandra's mouth twitched. She continued. She returned for the food at first, then because Evan spoke to her before knowing her title. After learning it, he changed only enough to stop calling her Lady Violet in front of ministers. He cared whether soldiers ate. He rejected noble gifts. He argued with her when she was unreasonable. He had nearly been eaten by wolves because a wounded driver could not run. Evan said that last example was not one of his better decisions. She agreed. Then she asked him directly, would he choose to remain beside her, not as a servant, but as her husband? Evan did not answer immediately. This was not a fantasy in which he had known her for 3 days. They had shared meals for months now. He had seen her angry, exhausted, amused, and silent. He knew she was ruthless when ruling, and unexpectedly patient with children. He knew she hated sweet wine, liked crisp duck skin, and pretended not to enjoy cheap noodles as much as she obviously did. He also knew marrying her would place a target on him, visible from neighboring countries. He told her that he had conditions. Lysandra raised one eyebrow. He said he would remain a cook. He would not become a decorative prince who sat through ceremonies all day. Nobles could not own his recipes or suppliers. She was not allowed to execute anyone for criticizing his food, unless the criticism involved an actual assassination attempt. Lysandra said that condition was oddly specific. Evan said he had met her ministers. Finally, one evening each week belonged to them. No ministers, no guards inside the room unless there was an emergency. No imperial petitions placed beside the soup. Lysandra considered all of it. Then she agreed. Evan held out his hand. She looked at it. He reminded her that ordinary people sometimes sealed agreements without blood oaths or imperial jade. She placed her hand in his. Her fingers were cool. With that handshake, the Immortal Empress became engaged to a first-breath cook. The legal process was less romantic. 3 ministries nearly collapsed. The empire's marriage law allowed the sovereign to choose a spouse freely, but the imperial consort received no automatic military command, succession authority, or right to rule independently. This prevented marriage from becoming a direct seizure of government. That made Evan legally acceptable. Politically, it made half the capital furious. The great clans lost the chance to place one of their heirs beside the throne. The Radiant dynasty lost years of diplomatic leverage. Traditionalists complained that a mortal consort lowered imperial prestige. Lysandra solved the legal arguments by signing the contract. She could not solve foreign perception as easily. Cassian requested one final public test. The Great Feast of Dynasties was already scheduled to mark the renewal of trade treaties. He proposed that Evan oversee the Veyron table personally. If foreign rulers and clan elders accepted the meal and publicly acknowledged him, the Radiant delegation would recognize the marriage and withdraw its claim. If Evan failed, Cassian would still recognize Lysandra's legal right to marry him. But the Radiant court would suspend several trade concessions and argue that the consort lacked ceremonial standing. It was not a duel over who owned Lysandra. It was a political contest over whether Evan could function in the position he had accepted. Evan agreed. Garrick read the feast requirements and swore for the first time in Evan's presence. They needed to feed 400 guests from 7 states. Each delegation had dietary restrictions, clan traditions, spiritual tolerances, and political expectations. Then the ingredient merchants began reporting shortages. Within 3 days, nearly every high-grade fish, rare herb, and premium spirit beast in the capital had been purchased through Radiant-linked trading houses. Garrick wanted to use imperial authority to seize supplies or open the military reserve cellars. Evan refused both. If they won by confiscating ingredients from merchants, everyone would say exactly what Cassian wanted them to say. That Evan was only powerful because he stood behind the Empress. The military stores were worse. Those reserves existed for sieges and border campaigns, and using them for his own wedding test would turn a culinary contest into a public subsidy from the army. The palace did have older fish and herbs in cold storage, but Garrick confirmed another problem. Icefin's cooling quality faded steadily after long storage, even when the flesh remained safe to eat. For 400 guests, Evan needed a fresh catch of roughly equal maturity, so the spiritual effect would be consistent from bowl to bowl. Small downstream fish varied too much and would require several times the labor to trim and portion. He spread the available market lists across his prep table. Cheap river fish, frost leaf, winter turnips, white mushrooms, low-grade shellfish. Ordinary grain. Garrick looked miserable. Evan touched the list of Icefin from the Northern Gorge. The system could not inspect ink. But he remembered the fish from a shipment weeks earlier. Common, undervalued, difficult to prepare because its flesh became chalky under high heat. Derek saw the expression and asked what terrible idea had occurred to him. Evan said they were going fishing. The Northern Gorge was not technically a fishing destination. It was a narrow river cut between black cliffs, 2 days from the capital, where icefin bred in deep pools fed by mountain snow. Most fishermen worked downstream. The largest fish stayed upriver because something large enough to eat fishermen lived there. Derek read that line in the preserve report twice. Then he asked Evan whether he had considered cooking grain instead. Evan said grain would be on the menu too. Derek looked disappointed that sarcasm had failed. The expedition left with Captain Mira, 20 Imperial Guards, Derek, Evan, 2 professional fishermen, 3 insulated wagons, and enough equipment to make the entire venture look less like grocery shopping and more like a small invasion. The expense was entered openly against the Great Feast budget, and the fishery rights came from a crown preserve that supplied the palace under contract. Nobody could honestly call it a secret gift from Lysandra, but she still imposed conditions after the wolf incident. Mira chose the route. Evan wore a new one-charge protective pendant, and he agreed that if the captain ordered him behind cover, he would go behind cover first and complain later. Lysandra wanted to go herself. Evan refused. She asked whether he had somehow forgotten which of them commanded the empire. He said no, but if the Immortal Empress personally collected fish for her own wedding feast, Cassian would claim Evan could not do anything without her. Lysandra said she could collect the entire river in one hand. Evan said that was exactly the problem. She stared at him for several seconds, then assigned Mira twice the normal number of guards. Before the convoy left, Lysandra handed Evan a dark jade pendant. It would release a single defensive barrier if his life was threatened. Evan accepted it because there was a difference between proving independence and becoming stupid. Mira approved of this distinction. They reached the lower gorge before sunset on the second day. Icefin were easy to catch there, but the specimens were small. Evan tested 3. The system confirmed his memory. Icefin, low spiritual aquatic beast. Natural properties: cooling circulation, mild calming effect. Primary culinary risk: protein collapse under direct high heat. Optimal handling: immediate bleeding, cold storage, gentle cooking. Excellent. But the banquet required a centerpiece, something large enough to serve as the basis of several hundred portions. The fishermen told them adult icefin could reach the length of a man in the upper pools. Mira asked what else lived in the upper pools. The fishermen looked at each other. A river mauler. Evan had hoped that was the name of a plant. It was not. The river mauler was a mid-grade spirit beast, resembling a crocodile crossed with a catfish, and apparently blessed with every personality flaw of both. It was territorial, armored, and strong enough to overturn a merchant barge. Mira could probably kill it with her elite guards. The upper river ran through narrow shelves of wet stone. A large beast could drag people into deep water, where cultivation advantage mattered less. Evan did not need the mauler. He needed the fish sharing its territory. They moved upriver at dawn. Derek came because he refused to let Evan choose banquet fish without culinary supervision. He carried 2 knives, no weapon, and complained about the mud with surprising creativity. After 3 hours, they found the first upper pool. Icefin flashed silver beneath clear water. Large ones. The fishermen began setting nets from a safe ledge, while guards watched the deeper center. Evan touched the first fish they pulled out. Good quality. A second was better. A third showed minor stress damage from the net. They had almost enough by midday. Then the river went quiet. Mira raised one fist. Everyone stopped. The water near the center of the pool bulged. Something moved beneath it, much larger than any icefin. The river mauler surfaced without warning. Its head alone was wider than Evan's torso. Dark plates covered the skull. 4 yellow eyes opened in pairs. Long whiskers trailed from a mouth packed with backward curving teeth. One fisherman screamed and dropped his net. The mauler surged onto the shelf. Mira struck first. Her spear hit the armored forehead and threw sparks. The beast barely slowed, Two guards attacked the front legs. Their blades cut between plates, but the mauler twisted with shocking speed and swept one man into the water with its tail. Evan saw the guard disappear. Mira dived after him. The fight broke apart immediately. Half the guards tried to hold the beast away from the ledge. The others threw ropes toward the water. Garrick dragged the second fisherman behind a rock. Evan moved toward the fallen guard, then stopped himself. Mira had been very clear about solid cover. He stayed behind a boulder and watched. The mauler's armor was strongest on the head and back. Its belly touched stone whenever it lunged. The mouth opened wide before each charge. The system would not analyze a living animal unless Evan touched it, and he had no intention of doing that. He looked at the fishing equipment instead. Buckets of chopped bait, icefin guts, mineral salt, a coil of weighted net. Then he noticed the small shapes in a shallow side channel. Juvenile maulers, 3 of them. The adult was not hunting, it was defending a nest. Evan shouted this to Mira. She had just hauled the soaked guard onto a shelf. She looked toward the juveniles and understood. The adult attacked whenever anyone came between it and the side channel. Mira ordered the guards to pull back toward the downstream ledge. The pressure eased slightly. The maulers stopped advancing for 1 second. That confirmed it. Evan crawled behind the rocks to the fishermen's bait buckets. He mixed chopped fish with blood from the cleaned ice fin, then added a handful of the stronger-smelling river shellfish they had collected for the feast. He stuffed the mixture into a canvas feed sack and tied it to a rope. Garrick asked whether Evan had once again decided to solve a battle using dinner. Evan said it kept happening around hungry animals. The plan was simple enough to explain, and dangerous enough that Mira called it stupid. They would not lure the adult away from its young. That had failed with predators before, because parental defense outweighed hunger. Instead, they would move the juveniles themselves. A narrow side stream connected the nursery channel to another protected pool farther upstream. The juveniles were small enough to follow scent through it. Evan tossed pieces of bait into the side stream, creating a trail away from the battle area. The first juvenile investigated, then the second. The adult saw them move and turned its head. That was the opening. Mira did not attack. She ordered everyone still. The third juvenile followed the bait. The adult backed toward them. Evan pulled the feed sack slowly through the shallow stream, keeping the scent ahead. He stayed behind rocks and used a long hooked pole rather than exposing himself. The juveniles moved upstream. The adult followed. For almost 30 seconds, nobody breathed properly. Then one guard shifted his boot on wet stone. The adult spun. Its tail smashed into the rock shelf and showered the group with fragments. The plan nearly collapsed. Mira stepped into the open and struck the stone in front of the beast with her spear, drawing its attention to herself. The mauler lunged at her. She retreated 3 steps, not trying to win, only buying time. The juveniles reached the upstream pool. The adult hesitated between Mira and the scent of its young. The mauler abandoned the fight. It slid into the side channel and followed. Everyone remained motionless until the armored back disappeared beyond the rocks. Then Garrick sat down in the mud. He said he was never insulting ordinary market fish again. Mira told the fishermen to take only the nets already set and leave the remaining pool alone. The group had enough ice fin. There was no reason to provoke the mauler again. Evan agreed immediately. Clearing an entire breeding pool for one banquet would have been wasteful, and Mira formally marked the upper channel as protected until the preserve wardens could study the nest. They spent the afternoon bleeding and packing the fish properly. Evan supervised the cooling layers. Garrick checked portions. The guards repaired equipment. While cleaning the largest ice fin, one fisherman found something hard lodged deep in its stomach. He assumed it was river stone. Evan washed it. It was a seed, silver gray, no larger than his thumbnail, with fine lines across the surface like veins of moonlight. The instant he touched it, the system changed. Unknown ingredient. Origin: outside local world classification, spiritual density, beyond current processing range, potential culinary applications, inaccessible, required preparation condition, flame source unavailable in current world. Recommendation, preserve. Evan read the lines twice. Until that moment, the system had always given him an answer. Sometimes the answer was discard. Sometimes it offered several methods. This was the first ingredient it could not fully process. Garrick asked what he was looking at. Evan said he did not know, which was entirely true. He wrapped the seed in waxed cloth and placed it inside the jade storage box Lysandra had given him for rare spices. Mira noticed, but did not press. The expedition returned to the capital 3 days later. By then, news of Evan's engagement had spread to every district. He discovered this at the palace gate. A row of officials waited to greet the imperial consort. Evan climbed down from the wagon, with the largest ice fin over one shoulder, because he did not trust a servant to carry it by the gills. 30 officials bowed. Evan froze with a wet fishtail hanging beside his face. One minister said, "Welcome home, imperial consort." She was smiling far too openly. Garrick walked past and told the officials the imperial consort needed to put his fish away. The story spread through the palace before dinner. Lysandra waited in Evan's kitchen and watched him clean the centerpiece fish. She asked whether he had enjoyed his first formal reception. Evan said the fish had shown greater dignity. He told her about the river mauler and the young. Her expression tightened when she heard there had been a battle. He reminded her that nobody had died. The guard knocked into the river had only bruised ribs, and the beast had been left alive. Then he showed her the silver seed. Lysandra's amusement vanished. She did not recognize it either. She called for the imperial archivist, who examined the seed through 3 lenses and refused to touch it directly. The archivist found no match in local records. He did identify one detail. The energy pattern resembled fragments sometimes found inside ancient spatial rifts. Materials believed to have fallen from higher realms. Lysandra ordered the seed sealed in Evan's private pantry rather than the imperial vault, because the system of ownership mattered to him. Evan appreciated that more than he said. The feast remained the immediate problem. They had 9 days. Preparation became a military campaign. Garrick built schedules for every kitchen hall. Evan designed the menu around ingredients Cassian's merchants had ignored because they lacked prestige. The centerpiece became gently poached ice fin with frostleaf broth, charred winter turnip, and fermented grain sauce. The second course used ordinary shellfish with aromatic oil. The meat course relied on low-grade mountain lamb instead of rare phoenix pheasant. Dessert used pear, toasted grain, and a mild spirit honey. Garrick initially objected that the menu looked too simple for a dynastic feast. Evan asked whether he wanted to impress guests with the price list or the food. Garrick said, ideally both. Evan told him he could engrave the bill on gold tablets afterward. They tested every course. Several failed. The first ice fin trial turned mushy because the palace's largest steam oven held heat unevenly. Evan could see the correct endpoint for a small portion, but not compensate for 600 fillets cooking at once. He and Garrick spent half a day measuring the oven with trays of water. They discovered the rear left corner ran much hotter because one fire array had been repaired incorrectly years earlier. Rather than rebuild the array before the feast, they rotated trays on a strict schedule. The second batch succeeded. The frostleaf broth created another problem. In small quantities, the herb's cooling property was pleasant. In a huge cauldron, the spiritual effect concentrated near the bottom and made the first serving almost numb Evan's tongue. The system showed the issue after he touched the finished broth. He changed the process. Frost leaf would be infused in separate smaller pots, strained, then blended into the main broth gradually. Garrick began writing everything down. Evan teased him about finally admitting market cooking had value. Garrick replied that he was documenting errors so future generations could avoid hiring stubborn reincarnated idiots. Evan paused. Garrick had no idea how accurate one word had been. The final complication came from people rather than food. Several noble clans demanded private menu adjustments. One wanted a separate high-rank dish for its patriarch. Another requested that its emblem be carved into every vegetable garnish. A third offered 200 gold for Evan to publicly praise their family vineyards. Evan rejected all three. The clan representatives complained to Lysandra. She sent them back to Evan. One came into his kitchen furious and declared that his family had supported the throne for 200 years. Evan asked whether that changed his allergy to shellfish. The representative blinked. Evan said his kitchen would accommodate health and cultivation restrictions. It would not turn a wedding feast into advertising. The man threatened political consequences. Garrick, chopping onions nearby, asked whether political consequences could wait until after the lunch rush. The representative left. Evan looked at Garrick. Garrick said palace kitchens corrupted people eventually. 3 days before the feast, Chef Gianvaro visited without Cassian. He requested permission to inspect the imperial kitchen, a common courtesy between royal chefs before a shared event. Garrick agreed reluctantly. Gian walked through the prep halls, examining the inexpensive ingredients with a neutral face. He touched an ice fin fillet and asked whether this was truly Evan's centerpiece. Evan said yes. Gian did not laugh. He said the fish was difficult to cook well and easy to overheat. Evan replied that was why he had chosen it. Gian looked at the tray rotation marks painted beside the steam oven. He understood immediately what they were for. Then he smiled for the first time. He said he had expected a favorite amateur. Evan said he had expected an arrogant immortal. Gian replied that there was still time for both of them to be disappointed. Before leaving, Gian warned Evan indirectly. He said political contests around kitchens were dangerous, because rulers sometimes forgot chefs had to stand near knives, fire, and food. Evan asked whether Cassian planned something. Gian's expression closed. He said he had spoken only as one cook to another. Evan told Mira. Security doubled around the stores. Mira also ordered Deputy Formation Steward Orlin Voss to inventory every foreign fixture already inside the palace. Voss had worked in the formation office for 11 years and had the forgettable competence of a man people trusted with locks, seals, and maintenance schedules. He reported that the radiant ceremonial braziers were hollow display pieces. The gallery lamps answered the palace network normally, and no foreign crystal had been installed anywhere outside the ceremonial kitchen. Nothing happened. No poison appeared. No assassin entered the pantry. The quiet worried Evan more. On the night before the feast, Lysandra found him alone in the side kitchen, staring at the silver seed through its glass container. She asked whether he was afraid. Evan said yes. The answer seemed to surprise her. He explained that fear was normal when hundreds of people could watch him ruin the most important meal of his life. Lysandra said he had cooked under pressure before. He said not while half the continent judged whether he was embarrassing his wife. Her eyes softened at the word wife. She sat beside him. The formal wedding ceremony had been delayed until after the great feast, because the foreign delegations were already traveling. Legally, the imperial marriage contract had been signed. Politically, tomorrow would make the union public beyond dispute. Lysandra told him that even if every person at the feast insulted him, she would not undo the marriage. Evan looked at her. He said he knew. He wanted to succeed because accepting her hand could not be allowed to make him disappear behind her throne. Lysandra touched his silver streak of hair, a gesture she had started doing without noticing. She told him to sleep. Evan said there were 40 gallons of broth to check at dawn. She threatened to carry him to bed herself. He considered the relative difference in strength and went voluntarily. The Great Feast of Dynasties began at noon. By sunrise, the imperial kitchen already sounded like war. Knives struck boards, water rushed through rune channels, assistants carried trays in both directions. Garrick stood on a raised step with a ledger and shouted times to 6 kitchen teams. Evan moved between stations, wearing a clean white chef coat with dark blue trim. He had refused ceremonial robes because loose silk near open flame was a practical argument against tradition. His cobalt hair had been tied back. The silver streak above his right temple remained visible. A narrow black cord around his neck held Lysandra's protective jade beneath the coat. Mira inspected every entrance, She also made the palace formation office repeat its inspection of the foreign ceremonial fixtures. The 4 white stone braziers from the Radiant delegation had arrived 6 days earlier and had tested inert on arrival. That morning, Deputy Formation Steward Orlin Voss broke and replaced the wax seals on their crystal chambers in front of 2 guards, confirmed that the chambers were empty, and signed the inspection ledger. Mira still made him test the gallery lamps and the west wall barrier twice. Everything answered normally. Chef Jian kept the 3 flame crystals he intended to use during the principal course under his own supervision. 4 spare calibration crystals from the same demonstration set were stored separately in a locked supply room. That separation was one reason the empty ceremonial braziers appeared harmless. 2 tasters checked ingredients for foreign toxins. Evan checked them again through the system whenever possible. At 11:30, the first delegation entered the feast hall. At 11:45, a junior cook dropped an entire tray of prepared turnips. At 11:47, Garrick informed Evan that panic would not improve vegetables. They recovered with a reserve batch. At noon, the bells sounded. The feast began. The hall could seat 400 beneath a ceiling painted with constellations. 7 state banners hung from the upper galleries. Lysandra sat at the central dais in black and silver imperial robes. Her hair flowed loose down her back beneath a slim jade crown. The golden crescent on her forehead shone brighter than Evan had ever seen it. Cassian sat across the central aisle in red and white. Chef Jian worked in the opposing ceremonial kitchen on the west side of the hall. The first courses were collaborative. Each royal kitchen served smaller dishes representing its region. Jian's food was exceptional. Evan admitted that immediately. A flame-seared river shrimp at the table while preserving the shell's sweetness. A clear soup carried layered spiritual warmth without harshness. Even Garrick grunted approval. Then came the formal culinary comparison. Cassian had insisted on it publicly. Each head chef would serve 1 principal dish to a panel consisting of 7 rulers or representatives, with additional portions distributed through the hall. Jian went first. His attendants wheeled in a covered silver vessel large enough to bathe in. He lifted one hand. 3 fire crystals rose behind him. Red spiritual flame flowed around the vessel, without touching it. The lid opened. Inside lay suncrest pheasant, cooked with 7 luminous herbs, and a sauce made from condensed spirit wine. The aroma reached the entire hall. Several guests murmured approval before tasting. The dish deserved it. Evan received 1 evaluation portion in the kitchen doorway. He tasted carefully. Powerful, rich, technically precise. The pheasant's natural fire property spread warmth through his chest. Jian had done exactly what a master should. Garrick asked why he looked pleased. Evan said, because losing to bad food would be humiliating. Their turn came. No floating fire crystals appeared. No rare beast was unveiled. Evan's team carried out wide ceramic bowls, holding pale ice fin, clear frost leaf broth, charred turnip, and a spoon of dark fermented grain sauce. Some guests looked confused. Cassian's mouth curved faintly. The fish was common enough to appear in provincial markets, and Evan had chosen that simplicity deliberately. Evan stood beside the central table and explained only what mattered. Icefin disliked violent heat. Frostleaf became harsh if over-concentrated. The dish had been designed to let both remain themselves. Then he stepped back. The panel tasted. The first reaction was not dramatic. Nobody shouted. Nobody broke through a cultivation realm. The king of a western state simply took a second spoonful before speaking. Then a third. An elderly sect matriarch closed her eyes and asked whether there was more broth. A foreign general, who had spent the morning complaining about the simplicity of the menu, emptied his bowl. The effect spread through the room as additional servings arrived. The ice fin's cooling quality softened the lingering heat of Jian's previous course. The frost leaf cleared the palate. The fermented grain brought depth without overwhelming the fish. It tasted complete. Jian requested a bowl. He ate in silence. Then he walked across the ceremonial floor toward Evan. Cassian's gaze sharpened. Jian stopped in front of Evan and bowed his head once. He said the Veyron table had won the principal course. There was no hesitation. The hall erupted into conversation. Garrick looked smug enough to claim personal ownership of the river. Evan offered Jian his hand. He said next time he wanted to compete without princes attached. Evan said next time he wanted a kitchen with fewer diplomats. For a few minutes, it seemed the dangerous part was over. Then, one of the upper gallery lamps went dark. Mira saw it first. Her head snapped upward. A second lamp failed, then a third. The protective barrier around the feast hall flickered. Mira shouted for the doors to close. The west wall exploded inward. Stone fragments crossed the hall like arrows. Lysandra moved before the first piece reached a table. Violet light spread from her raised hand and hardened into a curved shield above the central guests. Debris struck it and burst into dust. At the same moment, the ceremonial braziers along the west wall ignited white. Heat slammed through the room, not like ordinary flame, but as spiritual pressure that reached directly into active meridians. Evan felt it pass through his skin and seized the faint energy in his meridians. His heart kicked hard. The floor seemed to tilt. Stronger cultivators reacted worse. A clan elder shouted and grabbed his chest as his own spiritual aura surged out of control. 2 foreign guards dropped to one knee. The sect matriarch who had praised the broth pressed both palms to the table, breathing through clenched teeth. Mira shouted that the braziers were part of a furnace array. Garrick swore those braziers had arrived as ceremonial gifts with the Radiant delegation. But the weapon inside them had not been there when Mira inspected them. Their sealed crystal chambers now shone white. Someone with palace access had opened them after the morning test, installed altered radiant flame cores, and resealed the housings. The failing gallery lamps were the second half of the sabotage. They prevented the palace formation from suppressing the foreign array when it activated. Black-clad figures poured through the broken west wall. Some wore servant uniforms beneath their outer robes. Others had hidden among the Radiant guards. Mira's soldiers met them immediately. The first clash sent tables sliding across the marble. Guests shouted. Several tried to rise and found their own cultivation fighting them. The furnace array fed on active spiritual circulation. The stronger a cultivator pushed against it, the more violently their internal energy heated. The attackers had prepared for that. Evan saw a black-clad man raise his sword and expose a thin gold seal strapped beneath his wrist. White fire bent around him instead of entering his meridians. Similar campaign seals flashed beneath the sleeves of several infiltrators. Their edges were already darkening from heat, so the protection was temporary, but it gave Cassian's strike team the minutes they needed. That explained the design. The attack did not need to overpower every ruler in the room. It only had to make their strength dangerous to themselves, while marked attackers remained functional. Evan's weak, first-breath cultivation was suddenly useful in the least flattering way possible. He was dizzy and sweating, but he could still move. Chef Jian could too, though red lines of heat had appeared along his neck. He wore no protective seal. He stared at the white flames and the ceremonial braziers. Then his face changed. He recognized them. He turned toward Cassian. The prince had not moved from his seat. A wider version of the same gold seal circled his sword wrist beneath the cuff of his formal robe. His golden eyes remained fixed on Lysandra. Jian said his name sharply. Cassian stood. He told Jian to remain where he was. Jian asked whether the 4 spare radiant flame crystals from his demonstration case had been stolen. Cassian did not answer. That silence was answer enough. Jian stepped away from the Radiant delegation. The eldest Radiant minister saw the campaign seal under one attacker's sleeve and went pale. He shouted an order in his own language. Unmarked Radiant guards immediately pulled back around their diplomats instead of joining the assault. And 2 of the 6 Radiant elders openly ordered their people to disarm anyone carrying an unauthorized sun seal. Cassian's own delegation split in front of the entire hall. Cassian's jaw tightened. He told the hall that this did not need to become a massacre. Lysandra had rejected an alliance that had kept the eastern border stable for decades. her ministers had allowed a mortal nobody to humiliate allied royalty. Several Veyron clans had already contacted Cassian privately, promising support if the marriage arrangement returned to what they considered proper. Evan understood then. This was not a spontaneous tantrum because Jian lost a cooking contest. Cassian had prepared a political seizure before the feast. The contest had been the peaceful route. If Evan failed publicly, Cassian could weaken his standing, pressure trade partners, and continue negotiations. The furnace array was the coercive route. A Veyran collaborator inside the formation office was supposed to open the sealed braziers after inspection, steal the 4 spare crystals from Jian's demonstration case, alter them into furnace cores, disable the gallery lamps, and seize the central palace controls the moment the hall destabilized. Cassian's marked strike team would take key ministers and foreign delegates alive, with Lysandra forced to spend most of her power preventing hundreds of guests from burning inside their own meridians. Cassian expected to compel an emergency treaty that restored radiant military privileges, suspended Evan's ceremonial standing, and placed the palace formation under temporary joint control. Afterward, the Veyron collaborators would be blamed for starting an internal coup. Cassian intended to present his own forces as the faction that had imposed order and prevented a massacre. It was a brutal plan, but it had a political end state beyond simply killing everyone in the room. Mira had sealed the exits before Cassian's people secured the central controls. The palace formation masters were still fighting for their network. Jian had rejected Cassian publicly. Unmarked Radiant Guards had refused to support the attack. The West Wall breach had exposed infiltrators before they could stage anything resembling a rescue. Cassian still possessed one advantage. His larger sun seal was linked directly to the furnace array. For a short time, the same heat crippling the guests could feed his own fire, while Lysandra divided her strength across the hall. He had lost the clean political victory, but he still believed he could force one by defeating her before the protective seals burned out. He drew his sword. Golden fire wrapped the blade. Lysandra descended from the dais. Her expression was very calm. Evan had learned to fear that expression more than anger. She told Cassian he had mistaken patience for weakness. Cassian said she had mistaken personal desire for freedom from consequence. Then he attacked. The distance between them vanished. Evan saw only a gold line and a burst of violet light. The impact cracked the marble floor from one side of the hall to the other. Lysandra caught Cassian's sword between 2 fingers. For one absurd second, Evan thought the main battle might end immediately. Then the furnace array flared. White fire climbed the walls. Lysandra's protective barrier around the guests flickered. Cassian had timed the strike for that moment. He twisted the blade and released a ring of solar flame directly into her shield. Lysandra was much stronger than Cassian, but she was simultaneously holding back the spiritual heat threatening hundreds of people. Cassian's real advantage came from forcing her to divide that power across the entire hall. Lysandra shoved him backward, hard enough to send him through 3 tables. He landed on his feet, sliding 20 yards. The ceiling above the west side cracked. She could kill him. Evan believed that completely. She could not do it at full strength, while maintaining protection over every unstable guest and preventing the palace from collapsing around them. An assassin rushed Evan from the side. Mira intercepted him. Her spear punched through the attacker's shoulder and drove him into a pillar. She shouted at Evan to get into the kitchen. For once, he did not argue. He grabbed Garrick by the sleeve and ran through the service doors. Jian followed. The kitchen corridor had become its own battlefield. 3 disguised servants were attacking the inner guards. One had slashed a pantry assistant across the shoulder and dropped him behind a serving cart, badly wounded, but still moving. Another tried to block the door to the main hall. Mira's deputy, a broad man named Corin, held the corridor with 4 guards. These opponents were not equal to Lysandra or Cassian. They were trained infiltrators around the same level as elite guards. The fight needed more than one effortless strike, but it was still a battle for soldiers, not cooks. Evan stayed behind Corin. One assassin threw a black needle past the guard line. Evan ducked. The needle struck a wooden door and dissolved a hand-sized patch around it. Poison. Garrick grabbed Evan by the back of his chef coat and pulled him farther behind the preparation counter. He told Evan that if he died, Garrick would personally drag him back and kill him again for abandoning service during a banquet. Evan said, "That sounded inefficient." Jian raised both hands. The 3 fire crystals over his shoulders blazed. He was an immortal chef, but spiritual cooking required serious cultivation. His flame control was not designed for duels, yet it was more than enough to matter in a narrow corridor. He sent a sheet of red flame across the floor. The assassins jumped back. Corrin's guards advanced at the same moment. One attacker fell. Another fled toward the cold storage rooms. The third smashed a jar against the floor. Black smoke erupted. Evan's eyes watered instantly. Everyone lost sight of one another. He heard steel, a grunt, then someone hit a table. The smoke carried an oily, bitter smell. Evan knew smoke. Kitchens created enough of it. This one was heavier than air and thick with some resinous powder. He crawled low and reached the water channel valve beneath the sink. Then he opened every tap in the preparation line and shoved wet cloths toward Garrick and the assistants. Jian used a controlled flame burst near the upper vents, heating the air without igniting the smoke. Hot air rose fast and pulled the black cloud toward the ceiling extraction shafts. Within seconds, visibility improved. Corrin found the assassin crouched behind a table. The guard captain broke the man's wrist, disarmed him, and drove him face first into the floor. Evan stood carefully. His hands were shaking. He did not pretend they were not. Garrick's left sleeve was cut, but the skin beneath looked intact. Jian leaned against the counter, breathing harder. The furnace array affected him much more strongly because of his cultivation. Evan asked how long he could keep fighting. Jian said that if he used his spiritual flame heavily, the array would begin burning him from the inside. That was bad. The main hall erupted with another impact. Dust fell from the ceiling. A kitchen apprentice screamed. Evan forced himself to think about the actual problem. The furnace array was overheating cultivators. Destroying it would be ideal, but that required people who understood formations and could reach the braziers while Cassian's forces defended them. The palace formation masters were probably already trying. Evan could not help with that. What could a cook do? He looked at the prepared feast. Ice fin, frost leaf. The main course already carried a natural cooling property. Guests, who had eaten full portions, seemed to have resisted the first heat surge slightly better. Evan remembered the sect matriarch. She had been suffering, but she remained conscious while stronger men nearby had collapsed. The food could not cancel the array, but it might stabilize people long enough for Lysandra and the formation masters to fight properly. The problem was quantity and speed. 400 guests. Some had eaten only a few bites. The prepared reserve broth could serve perhaps 80. They needed more. Evan ran to the cold storage inventory. They still had ice fin trimmings, bones, frost leaf infusion prepared for later courses, winter pear, and several vats of plain stock. The system gave him possibilities as he touched each ingredient. Ice fin bones retained strong cooling mineral content. Frost leaf infusion could be blended into stock if kept below a certain concentration. Winter pear contained natural fluid and mild sweetness. Useful because people under spiritual heat were becoming dehydrated. This was not a refined banquet dish. It was emergency food. Evan started giving orders. Garrick listened for 10 seconds, then took over half the room. He sent assistants to every cauldron. Bones went into pressure kettles used normally for rapid stock extraction. Jian, unable to use strong spiritual flame safely, controlled low heat across 3 vessels with exquisite precision. Evan built the first batch himself, checking ratios constantly. The system warned him when the frost leaf concentration became too high. He diluted it. A second warning appeared when the ice fin bones released a bitter compound after prolonged boiling. He pulled them early. Garrick tasted the result. It was rougher than the feast broth, saltier and simpler, but clean. Evan touched the finished pot. Prepared cooling broth. Natural effect. Reduces spiritual heat accumulation. Supports circulation stability. Limit. Cannot suppress external formation directly. Recommended serving. Small, repeated portions, exactly what they needed. Now they had to get it into the hall. Mira appeared through the service door, with blood on her armor. Not hers, she said before Evan asked. The main hall was divided. Loyal guards held the eastern half. Cassian's men controlled access to 2 western braziers. Palace Formation Masters had disabled 1 node, but 3 remained active. Lysandra was fighting Cassian above the central floor, while maintaining the protective barrier. Evan told Mira about the broth. She understood the value immediately. Then, she looked at the huge cauldron. They had a distribution problem. Serving bowls one at a time would take too long. Garrick pointed toward the banquet tea carts. Each cart carried 2 insulated beverage urns with spigots. Within 3 minutes, the kitchen transformed from restaurant to field hospital. They filled the urns. Assistants loaded cups. Guards formed teams around each cart. Mira assigned 1 soldier per server. Evan wanted to go with them. Mira said no. He argued that he could identify which guests needed smaller portions based on cultivation reactions. She replied that if he stepped into the hall, every enemy who understood Cassian's purpose would know exactly who to kill. She was right. Jian solved the problem. He knew enough about cultivation to brief the servers on danger signs. He stayed in the kitchen because the furnace array made extended exposure risky, but he described which guests should receive repeated small cups and which were likely to react badly to too much frost leaf. Mira led the first carts out. The hall beyond looked nothing like a feast now. Broken tables formed barricades. Violet light covered the central delegates. White flame burned along the walls. Cassian and Lysandra moved through the air above the dais, colliding in bursts Evan could barely follow. Mira's teams pushed low behind overturned tables. An assassin saw the first cart and rushed it. A Veyron guard blocked the strike. The attacker changed direction and aimed for the urn itself. That told Mira the enemy understood quickly. She drove her spear through his thigh, twisted, and threw him away from the cart. 2 more attackers focused on the servers. Foreign guards, who had already received the broth, joined the defense. The first distribution route held. Guests drank. The effect was not dramatic, but it was visible. A clan elder, whose aura had been flaring uncontrollably, managed to pull it back against his body. The Western King stopped shaking. Several guards regained enough control to stand. That changed the balance of the hall. People who had been liabilities became combatants again. Cassian noticed. His face turned toward the service door. Lysandra hit him. The blow sent him through the remains of a carved screen. She had gained a little freedom because fewer guests depended entirely on her shield. Cassian rose with blood at the corner of his mouth. He shouted an order. 2 assassins broke from the western line and sprinted toward the kitchen. The second used a movement technique and blurred past her. He crossed the service threshold before Corin could close it. The man was vastly faster than Evan. He wore a half mask and carried 2 short blades coated in dark green poison. Corin attacked from the side. The assassin twisted around the guard's sword, kicked him into the wall, and kept moving toward Evan. His target was clear. Evan backed into the main kitchen. Garrick threw a cleaver. It missed by a foot. The assassin smiled. Evan had perhaps 3 seconds. The protective pendant hung beneath his coat. He could trigger it. Lysandra had said it would stop 1 lethal attack, and using it was his safest option. He reached for it. Then the assassin kicked a preparation table toward him. Evan stumbled aside. The pendant slipped from his fingers. The man closed the distance. Evan grabbed the first object beside him. A bin of pale hearth ash, kept for scrubbing iron pans. He snatched up the bin and threw the dry ash directly into the assassin's face. Pale ash burst across the man's mask and clothes. The assassin shut his eyes for a fraction of a second. Evan ran behind the steam kettles. The killer followed, wiping ash from his face. Now, every movement left pale prints across the dark floor. More importantly, the ash clung to the assassin's damp clothing and disturbed the faint blur of his movement technique. Evan could finally see where he was going. The man lunged around the first kettle. Evan opened the steam release valve. A roaring cloud erupted between them. The assassin jerked back to protect his eyes. Evan ran the opposite direction. This was not a duel he could win. His only realistic objective was to survive until someone stronger arrived. The assassin understood that too. Instead of chasing through the steam, he jumped onto the counter and came over the top. Evan barely raised a metal tray in time. One poisoned blade punched through it. The tip stopped an inch from his chest. The impact threw him backward. He hit the floor hard. The assassin tore the blade free and stepped forward. Evan triggered the pendant. Black jade shattered against his chest. A translucent violet barrier appeared. The poisoned blade struck it and stopped. The assassin's eyes widened. The barrier would hold one attack. Evan kicked the lower shelf of the prep table. A heavy ceramic jar of pickled vegetables rolled under the assassin's feet. His boot slipped. He caught himself instantly, but that instant was enough. Garrick slammed a cast iron pan into the side of his masked head with both hands. The sound was magnificent. The assassin staggered. Jian, standing 10 feet away, flicked 2 fingers. A narrow line of red flame wrapped the assassin's sword arm, controlled precisely enough to force him to drop the poisoned blade without burning him alive. Corin arrived from the corridor and tackled the man through a table. 3 guards pinned him. Evan stayed on the floor, breathing hard. Garrick looked down at the bent pan. He said that had been his favorite. Evan promised to buy him another. Garrick said the assassin should buy it. The second broth batch finished. They kept working because finishing the broth mattered more than pretending the kitchen fight had made Evan a warrior. Within 10 minutes, most guests had received at least 1 cup. Palace Formation Masters disabled a second furnace node. Foreign cultivators who had regained control joined Veyran guards against the remaining infiltrators. The balance shifted completely. Lysandra's protective barrier contracted from the whole hall to only the weakest guests. Power returned to her body, like a storm being released from a bottle. Cassian realized it too late. He attacked with everything he had. Golden fire formed a massive blade above him, bright enough to turn the broken hall orange. The sun seal around his wrist cracked as the remaining furnace braziers answered it, feeding stolen heat into the strike. The protection that had kept the array out of his meridians was burning itself apart to power one final attack. Lysandra raised one hand. Violet light condensed around her fingers. For the first time since the battle began, she stopped protecting everyone else. The foreign rulers now had their own barriers up. Mira's guards had moved civilians behind the eastern wall. The cooling broth had stabilized the worst cases. Lysandra could fight. Hassian's golden blade fell. She stepped forward and punched it. The construct shattered. The shockwave blew out every intact window in the hall. Cassian's face changed. Lysandra crossed the distance before he could retreat. She struck him once in the chest. His armor collapsed inward. He hit the floor hard enough to create a crater. He tried to rise. She put one foot on his sword arm. The marble beneath him cracked. The battle ended there. It lasted no longer because Cassian had never been her equal. His entire plan depended on dividing her strength. Once that failed, so did he. The remaining attackers surrendered within minutes. The furnace nodes were destroyed. White fire disappeared from the braziers. The palace barrier stabilized. Silence settled over the ruined feast hall. Then, someone coughed. A table leg collapsed. A foreign king, still holding a cup of cooling broth, looked around at the broken walls and said he assumed dessert had been delayed. Laughter broke out in several places at once. It sounded strained and exhausted, but it was real. Evan came out of the kitchen with Garrick and Jian. His white chef coat was gray with ash. One sleeve had torn. There was a bruise forming across his ribs where he had hit the floor. Lysandra saw him. She left Cassian in Mira's custody and crossed the hall. Her eyes went immediately to the shattered pendant cord around Evan's neck. Evan knew that expression. He said the pendant had worked perfectly. She asked who had broken it. Mira, from behind Cassian, told her the assassin was alive for questioning. Evan silently thanked Mira for understanding the more dangerous problem. Lysandra looked toward the prisoner. The assassin visibly reconsidered whether being alive was a benefit. He told her there were 400 people still waiting for the feast. Lysandra stared at him. Half the hall was destroyed. The west wall was open to the afternoon sky. 3 tables were on fire. Evan said the main kitchen still worked. Garrick added that the lamb course had survived. Jian looked at both of them as though this was the first truly insane thing he had seen all day. Then he looked at the guests. Many were injured lightly. A few guards had suffered serious wounds and were being treated by palace healers. No ruler had died. Most of the food remained secure behind the service wing. Jian rolled up his sleeves. He said the radiant kitchen would help. Evan nodded. The full banquet was over. Nobody sensible pretended otherwise. Healers moved the seriously wounded to the infirmary. Investigators sealed the ruined West Hall, and Mira had the Eastern Gardens searched twice before allowing a single serving cart through. Every surviving dish was checked again for tampering. 3 hours later, after the dead had been identified and the last unstable guest could stand without assistance, the 7 delegations agreed to share one final course in the Eastern Courtyard. It was not a continuation of ceremony, so much as a public refusal to let Cassian decide how the day ended. Undamaged tables were carried outside. Guests sat wherever space allowed, instead of according to rank. Several rulers still held cooling broth cups in one hand, while eating the surviving lamb course with the other. Nobody complained about protocol. Cassian and the marked attackers were taken to the Imperial prison under seals placed jointly by Veyron and foreign witnesses. The rest of the Radiant delegation was disarmed and confined to its guest compound as witnesses until individual involvement could be established. Their own ministers cooperated. The unauthorized Sun Seals made the first separation simple, and captured infiltrators provided names for the rest. The distinction mattered politically, because Lysandra could not be accused later of treating every Radiant visitor as an enemy or inventing the conspiracy after the fact. Chef Jian gave a formal statement that 4 spare flame crystals had been removed from his sealed demonstration case without his knowledge. Investigators recovered those 4 altered crystals from the disabled braziers and found the empty spare cases, copied seal stamps, and crystal engraving tools in a maintenance vault beneath the Western Gallery, a room accessible through Deputy Formation Steward Orlin Voss's office. Voss was arrested before midnight. Ledger marks showed he had reopened the supposedly empty brazier chambers after Mira's inspection under the pretext of correcting a lamp channel. Temporary servant passes, issued through the same office, explained how several infiltrators had entered the service wing. Coded correspondence linked Voss, 2 Veyron noble factions, and Cassian's private military staff. His motive proved painfully ordinary. He had accumulated private debts larger than his annual salary, and had been promised money and a senior ministry post if the plan succeeded. The evidence would take weeks to process. The political result was immediate. Every foreign delegation had watched Cassian activate the attack, while senior members of his own delegation had refused to support him. His diplomatic leverage was gone. Near sunset, Evan finally found Lysandra alone on the broken western steps. She had changed out of battle-damaged robes, but had not repaired the cracked golden crescent mark at her forehead. It was apparently part of a defensive artifact, and could be restored later. Evan carried 2 bowls. One held the final portion of icefin broth. The other held noodles. Lysandra looked at the ruined wall behind them. She said rebuilding the hall would cost several thousand gold. Evan handed her the noodles. He told her walls could be rebuilt. Dinner could not be reheated indefinitely without becoming terrible. She looked into the bowl. Then, she laughed hard enough that she had to set the bowl on her knee, openly and without the careful restraint she usually carried into court. Evan sat beside her. Below the steps, workers moved for the courtyard. Guards carried debris. Healers checked the injured. Garrick shouted because someone had stacked dirty plates beside clean serving trays. Jian shouted back that the Radiant dynasty apparently had different emergency dishwashing traditions. Mira walked past with a prisoner and told both chefs that if either started another international conflict over plates, she would arrest them too. Lysandra ate the noodles. They were almost identical to the ones Evan had served her in the copper ladle months earlier. The broth was cleaner now. The noodles were better. Evan's hands were stronger. Lysandra noticed. She told him the first bowl had tasted better. Evan looked offended. She took another bite and admitted she was lying. He told her imperial dishonesty would be reflected in the bill. She asked whether husbands charged their wives for dinner. Evan said only when their wives had recently destroyed part of the dining room. Her shoulder touched his. Neither moved away. The investigation into Prince Cassian Solvar became an international crisis. It did not become a war. That distinction mattered. The Radiant Emperor, Cassian's father, sent an emergency delegation within 8 days. Faced with testimony from 7 foreign states, captured assassins, the unauthorized campaign seals, altered flame crystals, Orlan Voss's maintenance records, and letters from Cassian's faction, he publicly disavowed the attack. Senior Radiant ministers who had been present at the feast confirmed that Cassian had acted outside their diplomatic mandate. Cassian lost his position as recognized heir, pending trial under a joint treaty court that already handled crimes involving officials of both states. The Veyron nobles who had secretly supported him were arrested by their own clan elders before Lysandra's soldiers reached their estates. Orlan Voss and several members of the palace formation staff were charged separately. From that week onward, foreign ceremonial devices were stored outside the inner palace until the day of use, and no single steward could approve, open, and reseal a formation fixture alone. Self-preservation remained a powerful political tradition. The Radiant Court withdrew every marriage claim. Trade concessions suspended during the crisis were restored with additional compensation. Evan paid attention to these details because he had learned that grand politics eventually reached kitchens as prices. The compensation agreement lowered tariffs on southern spices for 5 years. That interested him more than Cassian's inheritance dispute. The palace healers saved every guest injured by the furnace array, and the pantry assistant cut in the service corridor survived after surgery and several days of treatment. 2 Imperial guards died from the assassin attack, along with 1 foreign bodyguard. The palace held a memorial before any wedding celebration continued. Evan cooked for the families of the 2 guards himself. He did not make speeches. He knew one of them. Harlan had been the senior guard who fought Mira over the last iron tusk skewer. Months earlier, at the memorial meal, Harlan's younger brother asked whether it was true that Harlan had once stolen food meant for officers. Harlan had stolen food meant for Mira. The family laughed through tears. Evan served another plate. That scene mattered to him more than any title that followed. The wedding ceremony took place 3 weeks after the attack. This time, there were no foreign contests attached. Security inspected every brazier twice. Mira inspected them a 3rd time because she no longer trusted decorative fire as a concept. The ceremony filled the restored eastern courtyard rather than the damaged feast hall. White flowering trees arched over a long stone path. Black and silver banners hung from the palace terraces. Evan's formal clothing had been the subject of a week-long argument. The ceremonial tailors wanted 7 layers of embroidered robes. Evan asked how he was supposed to walk. They told him imperial consorts were not expected to move quickly during weddings. Evan said his life experience suggested that being unable to move quickly was a design flaw. A compromise produced a dark blue formal coat with silver trim over practical black trousers. The silver streak in his cobalt hair was left visible. Garrick claimed it made him look less like a lost kitchen assistant. Evan said Garrick's praise had become dangerously emotional. Lysandra wore black rather than traditional white because black and silver were the colors of the Veyron imperial line. Her long hair fell loose beneath a repaired jade crown. The golden crescent mark at her forehead had been restored, but a faint hairline crack remained visible if one stood close. Evan liked that she had not replaced it. It looked lived in. The ceremony itself was shorter than the rehearsals. The Imperial Archivist read the legal oaths. Evan promised loyalty to the Empire's laws, but did not swear obedience to the throne in private marriage matters, a clause Lysandra had personally added after their argument. Lysandra promised that his position as consort would not erase his profession property rights, or freedom to operate his own kitchens. Several older ministers looked as though they had swallowed lemons when that part was read aloud. Mara from the Western Market had been invited. She sat in the third row, wearing a new green dress, and openly cried through most of the ceremony. When Evan passed after the vows, she grabbed his sleeve and reminded him that he still owed her 2 bowls with interest. Lysandra heard. She asked what debt her husband had hidden from the treasury. Mara explained the borrowed bowls. Lysandra ordered the imperial treasury to repay them. Evan immediately refused to let the government settle a ceramic debt worth 4 copper. Mara told both of them to stop being ridiculous and accepted 12 new bowls from Garrick instead. The wedding meal was intentionally smaller than the Great Feast. No contest, no demonstrations, no dishes that required rare beasts dragged from distant mountains. Evan and Garrick designed food that represented the path from the outer market to the palace. There was grain porridge, like the one sold from Evan's first cart, though made with better stock. Iron tusk skewers in memory of the market incident. Moon pheasant prepared with low heat. Icefin broth from the gorge. Pear cakes from the council day. And finally, simple noodles. By evening, foreign rulers had departed, and ministers were drunk enough to stop discussing treaties. Evan escaped the main courtyard and returned to his side kitchen. Except it was no longer really his main workplace. Construction had finished on a new kitchen attached to the Imperial Garden. It contained 4 cooking stations, a private pantry, 2 large ovens, cold storage, a classroom for apprentices, and doors opening onto an outdoor dining terrace. Lysandra had offered him something larger. Evan had refused because he did not want to walk a quarter mile between the stove and pantry. The new kitchen belonged legally to Evan under the marriage agreement. Palace staff could work there, but no ministry controlled its menu. For the first time in either life, Evan owned his workplace. He stood inside after the wedding and ran his palm across the central wooden counter. The memory of the copper ladle came back with surprising clarity. Rotten meat, 12 copper. Doran shouting beside him. He had not forgotten Doran either. After Evan left, the copper ladle lost most of its customers. Doran tried to advertise himself as the man who had trained the imperial consort. This lasted until Mara told enough people what had actually happened. The restaurant still operated. Evan had not destroyed it, bought it, or asked Lysandra to punish the owner. Doran simply had to live with the business he knew how to run. That seemed sufficient. Evan's new salary and consort allowance made him wealthy by outer district standards, but he refused several unnecessary estates. He invested part of the money in reliable food suppliers instead. Mara became one of them. Her vegetable stall expanded into a warehouse partnership with 3 farms. She told everyone this was due to superior cabbage judgment. Evan did not argue. Garrick remained chief imperial cook. Evan refused to take the title from him. Instead, the palace created a separate position for Evan as imperial consort and personal chef to the sovereign. The title was absurdly long, so kitchen staff called him Chef Evan. He preferred that. Chef Jian remained in the capital for the investigation into Cassian. During that time, he and Garrick argued about fire technique almost daily. One argument lasted 4 hours and ended with both men preparing the same duck 3 different ways. Evan ate the experiments and declared diplomacy productive. Jian eventually returned to the Radiant Dynasty with a promise that his next visit would involve only cooking. Mira told him the promise would be written into his travel permit. The most unusual part of Evan's new life became the weekly public table. He had asked for it during wedding planning. One day each week, the outer section of the Imperial Garden opened to ordinary residents through a guarded gate. People could buy simple meals at ordinary market prices. The palace objected to allowing hundreds of commoners near an imperial residence. And the treasury objected that palace kitchens could not sell subsidized food forever, without naming who paid the difference. Evan solved the second problem with his own consort allowance. The public table bought ordinary ingredients at market rates and sold meals for enough to cover most of the food. Evan paid the remaining labor and security cost from the income attached to his position. Lysandra solved the first problem by moving the public tables near a separate garden wall and assigning normal security. The first public day attracted more than 1,000 people. Evan could not cook alone. That was exactly the point. He trained 6 young palace cooks to prepare his basic broths and noodles. The system still belonged only to him, so he tested batches and corrected process, but the apprentices did the work. One was a 17-year-old girl named Nessa with short orange hair and an alarming ability to chop onions faster than she listened to instructions. Another was a quiet young man named Theo, who had worked in the barracks kitchen and understood scale better than elegance. Evan deliberately recruited people from different backgrounds. He wanted a kitchen that could survive without his hands on every pot. Garrick approved, though he complained that Nessa talked too much. Nessa replied that Garrick complained too much. Garrick promoted her to the morning shift, where he could supervise her personally, which everyone understood as affection disguised as punishment. Lysandra sometimes appeared at the public table, disguised in the old black cloak. The disguise no longer worked. Children recognized the silver hair. One little boy asked whether she was really the Immortal Empress. Lysandra said yes. He asked why she was waiting in line. She pointed at Evan, because the cook was unreasonable. The boy considered this, then told her his mother said waiting one's turn was polite. Lysandra looked at Evan. Evan kept serving noodles and wisely said nothing. 3 months after the wedding, his cultivation finally reached second breath. There was no lightning, no heavenly vision. He woke one morning feeling warmer, steadier, and slightly stronger. His body had adapted gradually to good nutrition and low-grade spiritual ingredients. Mira tested him in the training yard. He lasted 12 minutes against her warm-up routine instead of 6. She congratulated him on becoming twice as difficult to accidentally kill. Evan considered that progress. He still wore the replacement protective pendant Lysandra gave him. This one had 2 barrier charges. She called it practical. Evan called it evidence she had no faith in his survival instincts. Mira said the pendant proved Lysandra had excellent judgment. Life settled into something close to normal. Court in the morning for Lysandra, kitchens for Evan, dinner together whenever possible. Occasional diplomatic guests. Ingredient trips conducted with guards who now inspected every forest for wolves before Evan was allowed out of a wagon. The silver seed remained locked in his private pantry. He checked it once a week. The system never changed its answer. Origin outside local world classification. Flame source unavailable. Preserve. Evan was curious, but curiosity did not make it urgent. He had an empire's worth of ingredients he had not tried yet. Then, one evening, the seed began to glow. Evan was preparing noodles after closing. Lysandra had arrived late from court and was sitting at the counter, with her crown beside one elbow. The public garden had emptied an hour ago. Garrick and the apprentices had gone home. Evan dropped a bundle of noodles into boiling water. From inside the pantry came a soft silver light. He opened the cabinet. The seed floated half an inch above its glass container. Lines of light spread across its surface. The system appeared. External resonance detected. Compatible spatial signature approaching. Evan read the second line twice. Lysandra was already on her feet. Her violet eyes sharpened. A palace bell rang in the distance. Not an alarm bell. A gate bell. Mira arrived several minutes later and reported that a single visitor had appeared outside the upper eastern gate. He had not crossed the barrier by force. He had simply emerged from a vertical line of silver light in the air and requested formal entry. He carried no visible weapon. He also possessed a cultivation aura none of the gate guards could measure. Lysandra's expression became careful. She told Mira to bring him to the outer audience chamber under full guard. Evan wrapped the silver seed and placed it inside his coat. Lysandra told him to remain in the kitchen. He asked whether the mysterious higher realm visitor had arrived because of the glowing ingredient currently in his pocket. She paused. Then she told him to remain behind her during the meeting. That was the compromise. The visitor looked young, perhaps 30, though age meant almost nothing among cultivators. His hair was pale gold and tied high. His robes were white, with constellations embroidered in silver thread. He introduced himself as Envoy Calum Eris of the Celestial Table. Evan decided that sounded less like a government office, and more like an expensive restaurant. He did not say this aloud. Calum bowed to Lysandra with respect, but did not kneel. That alone would have caused a diplomatic scene with any normal envoy. Lysandra allowed it. She could feel what Evan could not. This man came from somewhere above the power structure of their world. Calum produced a thin golden invitation. The writing on it shifted when viewed from different angles. He explained that once every several decades, the Nine-Realm Banquet gathered rulers, sect masters, cultivators, craftsmen, and chefs from connected lower and higher domains. Invitations were distributed according to several measures of influence. The Veyron Empire had never previously qualified. This year, something unusual had changed the calculation. Calum looked toward Evan. During the Great Feast attack, a wave of culinary spiritual resonance had crossed the palace barrier when hundreds of people consumed Evan's cooling broth, while the furnace array was active. The event had been registered by a higher realm observation formation. Evan asked whether someone in heaven had been monitoring soup. Calum's formal expression cracked slightly. He said the formation monitored spiritual anomalies. Evan said that answer was less entertaining. Lysandra was invited as sovereign. Her spouse was invited separately under the classification of culinary practitioner. Evan stared at the golden card. He had gone from a market cart to inter-realm catering in less than a year. That seemed irresponsible. Then he showed Calum the silver seed. For the first time, the envoy lost his composure completely. He stepped forward, then stopped himself before reaching for it. He asked where Evan had found a stargrain seed. Evan said, inside an ice fin from the northern gorge. Calum looked genuinely baffled. Stargrain did not grow in this lower world. It came from agricultural terraces in the third celestial domain. Even there, it was expensive. The seed must have fallen through an unstable spatial fissure, been swallowed by a spirit beast, then passed through the food chain until the ice fin consumed it. Evan asked why his ability said he lacked the required flame. Calum looked at him sharply. Evan realized he had revealed slightly too much. He corrected himself and said every preparation method he had tested suggested the seed required a different heat source. The envoy accepted that explanation. Stargrain could not be cooked with ordinary flame or the low spiritual fire available in the Veyron world. It required celestial heat with a stable void element, otherwise the grain's internal structure collapsed. For Evan, the information was thrilling. Not because it promised power, because there was food his current world literally could not cook. A whole category of ingredients existed beyond the ceiling he had assumed was the sky. Lysandra saw his expression and knew immediately what it meant. She asked Calum when the banquet would begin. Travel would be arranged through the Eastern Realm Gate. Participation was voluntary. Calum warned that the higher domains operated under different power scales. The Veyron Empire was sovereign here. At the Nine-Realm Banquet, Lysandra would be one ruler among many, some far older and stronger. Political protection would exist inside the formal grounds, but status would not carry the same weight. Evan asked about the kitchens. Calum blinked. Then he said they were excellent. Evan asked about ingredient markets. Also excellent. Lysandra rubbed 2 fingers against her temple. She told Calum they would consider the invitation. After the envoy left, Evan and Lysandra returned to the kitchen. The noodles were ruined. They had cooked for nearly half an hour. Evan lifted one with chopsticks. It broke under its own weight. He looked at Lysandra. She said this was clearly Calum's fault. Evan said an inter-realm envoy had destroyed dinner without touching it. Lysandra suggested executing him. Evan reminded her of the marriage condition concerning excessive executions. She said the condition applied to criticism of his cooking, not destruction of noodles. He threw the ruined batch away and started again. While the water heated, Lysandra picked up the golden invitation. She asked whether he wanted to go. Evan looked through the kitchen window. The imperial garden beyond was quiet. Lanterns reflected in the pond. Somewhere farther out, the capital continued around them. The market, where he had started, still opened every morning. His public tables would be full again Next week, he had a kitchen, apprentices, friends, and a wife who could split mountains, but still could not peel a pear properly. He did not want to abandon any of it. The invitation did not ask him to. A larger table. Ingredients his system could not yet solve. He told Lysandra yes. She nodded as though she had expected that. Then she asked when they should leave. Evan checked the invitation. 3 months. He said that was enough time. For what? He placed fresh noodles into the pot. A honeymoon. Lysandra looked at him for a second. Then she laughed and asked whether most husbands schedule their honeymoon before traveling to a higher realm full of dangerous immortals. Evan said most husbands were not married to her. The noodles finished. He divided them into 2 bowls. Lysandra reached for hers before he added the garnish. Evan tapped her fingers with the chopsticks. She stared at him. He told her the kitchen was still his territory. Lysandra pointed out that she owned the palace. Evan said the palace could wait 30 seconds. Outside, the strongest woman in the empire was obeyed by generals, ministers, and clans. Inside the kitchen, she waited for scallions. Evan set the finished bowl in front of her. 3 months later, there would be another world, another kitchen, and food he had never imagined. Tonight, dinner was simple. Lysandra stole 1 scallion from his bowl while he was looking away. Evan noticed, added 1 copper to an imaginary bill, and kept eating.